At 3 o'clock a.m., a pregnant teacher walked into an emergency room begging for help, and the nurse behind the desk looked her in the eye and laughed. What happened next was caught on camera by a janitor who refused to look away, witnesses who couldn't stay silent, and a system that never saw the reckoning coming. By sunrise, a single slap would end a career, expose a conspiracy of cruelty, and prove that some women carry more than life inside them. They carry the power to burn down walls that were never meant to protect people like her. Before we begin, I want to invite you on this journey. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with all of you around the world. The fluorescent lights in Metropolitan General's emergency room hummed with the kind of tired persistence that matched the 3 o'clock a.m. shift. Steady, cold, indifferent. The waiting area held the usual collection of midnight misery: a construction worker cradling a swollen hand, an elderly woman breathing through an oxygen mask, a college kid holding a bag of ice against his jaw, and scattered throughout, the worried relatives who'd been pulled from sleep by crisis. Behind the tall reception desk sat charge nurse Kendra Barlow, her perfectly maintained box braids pulled back tight, her scrubs crisp despite the hour, her expression carved from something harder than the marble print countertop she ruled like a throne. She'd worked this shift for 9 years, long enough to develop opinions about who deserved urgency and who deserved to wait, who warranted courtesy and who needed to be taught their place. The automatic doors whispered open, letting in a breath of cool October air and a woman who moved with the careful, weighted steps of someone carrying precious cargo through dangerous terrain. Nia Harper was 8 months pregnant, her belly pronounced beneath a cardigan she'd thrown over pajama pants, her natural hair pulled into a hasty bun, her brown skin sheened with the kind of sweat that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with pain. Her husband's jacket, too large for her frame, hung from her shoulders like borrowed armor. She'd driven herself here, gripping the steering wheel through contractions that felt wrong, too early, too sharp, accompanied by cramping that had woken her from dreams into something that tasted like fear. She approached the desk with one hand pressed against her lower back, the other cradling her belly in that universal gesture of pregnant protection, her face composed despite the tremor in her breath. "Excuse me," Nia said softly, her voice carrying the practiced patience of a high school English teacher who'd spent a decade navigating difficult conversations with grace. "I need to see someone. I'm 32 weeks pregnant and I'm having severe cramping and some spotting that started about an hour ago." Kendra looked up slowly, deliberately, her gaze traveling from Nia's worn sneakers to her anxious face with an assessment that felt less medical and more like judgment being passed. She set down her phone, she'd been scrolling through social media, and leaned back in her chair, the picture of someone being interrupted from more important business. "Name?" Kendra's tone was flat, bored, the single word delivered like she was doing Nia a favor by acknowledging her existence. "Nia Harper, Harper." Nia shifted her weight, trying to find a position that eased the pressure building in her abdomen. "I called my OB and she said I should come in right away because of the spotting and insurance card and ID." Kendra cut her off, extending her hand with the kind of impatient gesture usually reserved for toll booth transactions. Nia fumbled with her purse, her fingers clumsy with anxiety, finally producing both cards and placing them in Kendra's waiting palm. The nurse took them without urgency, tapping information into her computer with the speed of someone who had all night, occasionally glancing at the screen with theatrical sighs that suggested Nia's presence was a personal inconvenience. "You're going to have to take a seat in the waiting area," Kendra finally said, handing back the cards without looking at Nia's face. "We'll call you when we're ready." Nia's hand instinctively moved to her belly as another wave of cramping rolled through her. "I understand there are other patients, but my doctor specifically said that spotting at 32 weeks requires immediate evaluation. Is there any way—" "Did I stutter?" Kendra's voice snapped like a whip, loud enough that several people in the waiting area turned to look. "I said take a seat. We have actual emergencies to deal with. Your little tummy ache can wait." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Nia felt her face grow hot, felt the eyes of strangers landing on her like spotlights, felt something inside her that wasn't just physical pain begin to compress into a small, tight ball of humiliation. "I'm not trying to be difficult," Naya said quietly, her teacher voice kicking in, the one she used to de-escalate conflicts between students, the one that carried dignity even when delivering uncomfortable truths. "I'm just worried about my baby. The spotting is getting heavier and the cramping feels different than normal pregnancy discomfort. If something's wrong—" "Look at you, Dr. Google, over here," Kendra interrupted, her lip curling into something that might have been a smile on someone kinder. "You go to medical school? You get a nursing degree I don't know about? Or you just another one of these women who watches some YouTube videos and thinks she knows more than the professionals?" Nia's jaw tightened, but she held her composure. Years of teaching in underfunded schools had taught her how to navigate disrespect from people in positions of authority, how to advocate for herself without giving anyone an excuse to label her aggressive or difficult. A particular tightrope that Black women walked every day, knowing that the same assertiveness praised in others would be punished in them. "I'm not claiming to have medical expertise," Naya said carefully. "I'm simply relaying what my OB told me, Dr. Melissa Chen at Women's Health Associates. If you'd like to call and verify, I'm not calling anybody at 3 in the morning because you decided to have yourself a little panic attack," Kendra said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You pregnant women, I swear, every little thing is the end of the world. You know how many false alarms we get in here? You know how many of y'all waste our time because you ate too much Taco Bell and think you're in labor?" The construction worker with the swollen hand shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The elderly woman on oxygen looked down at her hands. The college kid with the ice pack stared openly, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. This wasn't standard hospital efficiency. This was something else entirely. "I understand you're busy," Nia tried again, her voice smaller now, the pain in her abdomen intensifying enough that she had to pause mid-sentence to breathe through it. "But I'm really not feeling well. If I could just be triaged—" "Triaged?" Kendra laughed, a sharp sound with edges like broken glass. "Listen to you with your fancy words. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to sit your behind down in that waiting room. You're going to wait like everybody else, and when we get around to you, we get around to you. This ain't the Ritz-Carlton. We don't do priority service just because you think you're special." Naya felt tears prick her eyes, not from the cruelty of the words, though they stung, but from the growing fear that something was genuinely wrong with her baby, and she was being forced to stand here pleading with someone who seemed to take pleasure in her distress. "Please," Nia whispered, and hated herself a little for the desperation in her voice. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just need someone to check that my baby's okay." "Your baby's fine," Kendra said with dismissive certainty, waving her hand like she was shooing away a persistent fly. "You're fine. It's probably just gas or Braxton Hicks or one of those things pregnant women get all dramatic about. Now move away from my desk before I call security and have them escort you out for causing a disturbance." The threat landed like a physical blow. Naya took a step back, her hand gripping the edge of the counter for balance as another cramp seized her, this one strong enough that she had to close her eyes and count through it. When she opened them, Kendra was already looking back down at her phone, the dismissal complete. Naya turned slowly, carefully, and made her way to the waiting area, sinking into one of the hard plastic chairs bolted to the floor. She pulled her husband's jacket tighter around her shoulders, breathing through her nose, counting seconds, trying to convince herself that Kendra might be right. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe by the time she saw a doctor, they'd tell her to go home and rest, and everything would be fine. But the cramping didn't ease. If anything, it intensified, waves of pain that made her grip the armrests of the chair and focus on a spot on the wall just to have something to anchor herself to reality. She pressed her hands against her belly, trying to feel the baby move, trying to find reassurance in those familiar kicks and rolls. Nothing. Just stillness and pain. 20 minutes passed. Then 30. Nia watched other patients get called back, the construction worker, a teenager who'd arrived after her with what looked like a sprained ankle, even the college kid who'd been nursing his jaw. She told herself there were reasons, medical priorities she couldn't see, legitimate triage decisions being made by people who understood things she didn't. But when a white woman arrived, younger than Nia, less visibly pregnant, complaining of mild nausea, and was taken back within 10 minutes, something in Nia's chest began to crack. She stood carefully and approached the desk again. Kendra didn't look up. "Excuse me," Nia said, her voice steady despite the fear climbing her throat. "I've been waiting for 35 minutes and the cramping is getting worse. I think I need to be seen soon." "You think?" Kendra's head snapped up, her eyes hard and bright with something that looked almost like satisfaction at Nia's distress. "You think? Well, I think you need to sit down and shut up before I have you removed from this hospital. You're not the only patient in this ER, and frankly, you're not even close to being the most important one." "I'm not trying to skip ahead of anyone," Nia said, fighting to keep her voice level. "But I'm 32 weeks pregnant with spotting and increasingly severe cramping. Those are warning signs of potential complications, preterm labor, placental abruption." "Oh, now you're diagnosing yourself?" Kendra stood up, her full height and the authority of her position suddenly deployed like weapons. "You think because you read some pregnancy blog you can come in here and tell me how to do my job? Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I've been a nurse for 15 years. I've delivered more babies than you've had hot meals. And I'm telling you that you're fine. You're just another paranoid pregnant woman wasting our time and resources that could be going to people with real emergencies." The construction worker was back in the waiting room now, his hand freshly wrapped, and he watched the exchange with growing discomfort. A woman who'd been dozing in the corner was now fully awake, her eyes wide. In the far corner, a night janitor had paused his work, mop in hand, his weathered face creased with concern. "I'm not paranoid," Nia said, her voice beginning to shake, not with fear now, but with something sharper. Anger at the injustice of being made to beg for basic care, fury at being dismissed and demeaned when she was at her most vulnerable. "I'm a patient who needs medical attention and I'm being denied." "Denied?" Kendra laughed again, that same cruel sound. "Nobody's denying you anything, drama queen. You're just not the priority you think you are. You want to know the truth? Women like you come in here all the time, making a fuss, expecting everyone to drop everything because you decided to get pregnant. Well, that's not how it works. You don't get to jump the line just because—" She paused, and something shifted in her expression, something uglier rising to the surface like oil on water. "Just because what?" Nia heard herself ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Kendra leaned forward over the desk, her voice dropping to a tone that was somehow more vicious for its quietness. "Just because you think playing the victim card is going to get you special treatment. I see your type all the time. Coming in here with attitude, expecting everyone to bow down, probably don't even have a steady income to pay for half the services you're demanding. You're probably on Medicaid, aren't you? Government assistance? And here you are acting like you own the place." The words landed like stones thrown at glass, each one finding its mark, each one designed to crack something fundamental. Nia felt the blood drain from her face, felt the full weight of what was happening here settle onto her shoulders like a mantle made of lead. This wasn't about triage. This wasn't about hospital policy or busy night shifts or emergency protocols. This was about power. This was about punishment. This was about a woman in a position of authority who had decided that Nia, black, pregnant, vulnerable, asking for help, didn't deserve dignity or urgency or basic human decency. "I have private insurance through my job," Nia said quietly, her hands trembling now, pressed against her belly where the cramping had become constant, a low roar of pain that made it hard to think straight. "I'm a teacher at Lincoln High School. I've been paying into the system my entire adult life. But even if I wasn't, even if I had no insurance at all, that wouldn't change the fact that I'm a pregnant woman in pain who needs medical care." "Oh, a teacher," Kendra said mockingly, her voice pitching higher in cruel imitation. "Well, excuse me, Your Majesty. You know what I think? I think you're exactly the kind of person who's making healthcare impossible for the rest of us. Coming in here, demanding attention, playing the race card." "I haven't said anything about race," Nia interrupted, her voice sharper now. "You don't have to," Kendra shot back. "It's written all over your face, all over your attitude. You come in here thinking everyone's against you, thinking everyone's discriminating against you, when the truth is you're just not as important as you think you are. You're not special. Your pregnancy isn't special. And whatever little discomfort you're feeling right now, it's nothing compared to what real emergency patients are dealing with." The janitor in the corner, Ramon Vega, his name badge read, a man in his 60s with calloused hands and eyes that had seen too much, slowly pulled his phone from his pocket and angled it toward the desk, his finger finding the record button with the careful precision of someone who understood he was witnessing something that needed to be preserved as evidence. Nia felt something wet and warm between her legs, felt her pajama pants growing damp, felt panic rising in her chest like floodwater. "I'm bleeding," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm bleeding more now. Please, You need to sit down and wait your turn," Kendra snapped. "And if you can't do that, you need to leave. Those are your options. I'm done playing games with you." "This isn't a game," Nia said, tears streaming down her face now, her hand pressed between her legs where the bleeding was becoming impossible to ignore. "Something's wrong with my baby. Please, I'm begging you." "Begging?" Kendra's lip curled. "That's what your type does best, isn't it? Begging for handouts, begging for attention, begging for special treatment you didn't earn and don't deserve. Well, I'm not impressed. You want health care? You want someone to take you seriously? Try showing some respect. Try understanding that the world doesn't revolve around you and your problems." A young woman in scrubs, a resident by the look of her, early 30s, Asian, her name tag identifying her as Dr. Elise Park, had emerged from the double doors that led to the treatment area. She'd apparently caught the last part of the exchange, her face registering shock and then hardening into something closer to fury. "What's going on here?" Dr. Park asked, her voice carrying authority despite her junior status. She looked at Nia, taking in the tears, the protective hand on the belly, the growing wet spot on her pants. "Ma'am, are you pregnant? Are you experiencing bleeding?" "Yes," Nia gasped, relief flooding through her at finally being seen, being heard. "I'm 32 weeks. I've been having cramping and spotting that's getting worse, and I think my water might have—" "She's fine," Kendra interrupted, her voice hard with warning as she stared at Dr. Park. "Just another false alarm. I've got it under control." "That's not your call to make," Dr. Park said firmly, moving around the desk toward Nia. "Bleeding in the 3rd trimester requires immediate evaluation. Why hasn't she been triaged?" "Because we're busy," Kendra said, her tone now defensive and sharp. "Because we have actual emergencies, because—" "Because what?" Dr. Park challenged, her eyes narrowing. "Because you decided she could wait? On whose authority?" The tension between them was palpable, a battle of wills playing out in front of an audience that had grown silent and attentive. The construction worker had his phone out now. The woman who'd been dozing was recording. Ramon the janitor kept his camera steady, his face expressionless, but his eyes blazing with quiet outrage. "On the authority of 15 years of experience," Kendra said coldly. "On the authority of my position as charge nurse on this shift. And if you have a problem with how I run my ER, Dr. Park, I suggest you take it up with administration in the morning. Until then, I make the calls about who gets seen and when." Dr. Park's jaw clenched, but she turned her attention back to Nia, professional focus overriding whatever anger she felt. "Ma'am, I'm going to take you back right now. How long have you been—" "You're not taking her anywhere," Kendra said, her voice rising now, the mask of professional courtesy finally falling away completely. "I'm the charge nurse. I determine patient flow. And I'm telling you that this patient waits." "I'm a physician," Dr. Park said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "And I'm telling you that I'm taking this patient back for evaluation right now." "Do that, and I'll report you for insubordination," Kendra threatened. "I'll document that you interfered with triage protocols. I'll make sure every attending physician on staff hears about how a first-year resident thinks she can override nursing judgment and disrupt the entire department because she wants to play hero." The threat hung in the air, heavy with implications. Dr. Park was young, her career barely started, her position precarious in the hierarchy of hospital politics. Kendra was established, protected by seniority and the informal power structures that often matter more than formal credentials. It was a calculation both women understood instantly, and one that Kendra clearly believed would force Dr. Park to back down. For a long moment, Dr. Park stood frozen, conflict playing across her face. Then she looked at Nia, really looked at her, at the pain and fear and helplessness, and something hardened in her expression. "Do what you need to do," Dr. Park said quietly to Kendra, "but I'm taking my patient back. If you want to report me, report me. I'll deal with the consequences." She reached for Nia's arm, prepared to guide her toward the treatment area, prepared to do what her oath required regardless of the personal cost. That's when Kendra stepped out from behind the desk. Later, everyone who witnessed it would describe that moment differently. Some would say Kendra moved with deliberate intent, her hand already rising as she crossed the space between the desk and where Naya stood. Others would say it happened fast, a flash of motion that seemed to surprise even Kendra herself. But everyone would agree on the sound, that sharp crack of flesh striking flesh that echoed through the waiting room like a thunderclap. Kendra had slapped Nia across the face. The force of it snapped Nia's head to the side, the shock of it more stunning than the physical pain. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The entire waiting room seemed to hold its breath, suspended in that frozen moment between action and reaction. Then Nia's water broke. Not the slow leak she'd been experiencing. This was a gush, sudden and unmistakable, fluid soaking through her clothes and puddling on the floor beneath her feet. And with it came a contraction so powerful that Nia doubled over with a cry that was equal parts pain and terror, her hands clutching her belly, her face contorted with agony. "Oh my God," Dr. Park breathed, immediately moving to support Nia. "Someone get a wheelchair, now!" But the waiting room had erupted into chaos. The construction worker was on his feet, his phone thrust forward, recording everything. The dozing woman was shouting, "She hit her! She hit a pregnant woman!" Ramon the janitor was already dialing 911, his voice urgent as he reported an assault in progress. Other patients were pulling out their phones, some filming, some making calls, all of them suddenly witnesses to something they understood was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Kendra stood frozen, her hand still raised slightly, her face cycling through expressions, shock, anger, fear, and then something like calculation as she seemed to realize what she'd done and what it meant. "She attacked me first," Kendra said loudly, her voice pitched to Carrie, suddenly aware of the phones, the recordings, the witnesses. "I was defending myself. She lunged at me and I—" "That's a lie," the construction worker shouted. "I saw the whole thing. She was just standing there and you hit her." "I have it on video," Ramon called out, his phone still steady in his weathered hand. Everything, from the moment she walked in. Nia couldn't focus on any of it. Another contraction hit, stronger than the first, her body seizing with pain that felt wrong, too intense, too fast. She was vaguely aware of Dr. Park calling for backup, of security guards appearing from somewhere, of voices overlapping in argument and accusation. Through the haze of pain, Nia managed to reach into her purse with shaking hands and pull out her phone. She could barely see the screen through her tears, could barely think through the contractions that were coming one on top of another now, but muscle memory guided her fingers to the contact labeled Adrian. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, her husband's voice came through, thick with sleep and instantly alert with concern. "Nia? Baby, what's wrong?" Nia tried to speak, but another contraction seized her, forcing out only a gasped sob. "Nia!" Adrian's voice sharpened with fear. "Talk to me. Where are you?" "Hospital," she managed to gasp out between pain-shortened breaths. "Metropolitan General, ER, something's wrong. The nurse, she hit me. The baby—" "I'm coming," Adrian said, and his voice had changed now, shifted into something that carried authority and barely contained fury. "Hold on, sweetheart. I'm 10 minutes away. Hold on." "They won't help me," Nia sobbed, the words tumbling out between contractions. "She wouldn't let them help me. She said I wasn't important. She said—" "I'm coming," Adrian repeated, and now there was steel underneath the tenderness. "And I'm not coming alone. Hold on, Nia. Just hold on." The call ended. Nia clutched her phone to her chest like a talisman, trying to breathe through the pain, trying to stay conscious and present even as her body seemed to be tearing itself apart. Dr. Park was beside her now, having somehow procured a wheelchair, helping Nia into it with gentle urgency. "I'm taking you back," Dr. Park said firmly, her voice brooking no argument. "I don't care what anyone says." But Kendra blocked their path, her face twisted with an emotion that looked like spite distilled to its purest form. "You're not going anywhere until security sorts this out," Kendra said. "This patient assaulted me, and now she's trying to cover it up by—" "Get out of my way," Dr. Park said, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "Get out of my way right now, or I swear to God—" "Or what?" Kendra challenged. "You'll hit me too. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You people always think the rules don't apply to you. You always think the automatic doors whooshed open. Adrian Harper walked into the Metropolitan General Emergency Room like a man who knew exactly what power looked like and exactly how to wield it. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hastily thrown-on jacket over a t-shirt and jeans. His natural hair cut close, his brown skin carrying the particular kind of authority that came from years of command and recently from office. But it wasn't his appearance that made the room go silent. It was what followed behind him. 2 police officers in uniform, a woman in an expensive suit carrying a briefcase, a man with a camera and press credentials, and behind them, moving with the careful urgency of someone summoned in the middle of the night for a crisis, came Dr. Robert Chen, the hospital's chief administrator, his face pale with growing dread as he took in the scene before him. Adrian's eyes found Nia immediately, taking in her tears, her pain, the wheelchair, Dr. Park's protective stance, and Kendra standing there like an obstacle placed deliberately in their path. His jaw tightened into something that could have been carved from granite. "My wife," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its softness. "Someone want to tell me why my pregnant wife called me crying, saying she'd been assaulted and denied medical care?" Kendra's face had gone pale, but she drew herself up, reaching for the same authority she'd wielded so effectively all night. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this is a hospital emergency room and we have protocols. I know exactly where I am," Adrian said, taking a step forward. Behind him, the woman with the briefcase had already pulled out a business card, showing it to the security guards who'd been hovering uncertainly. One of them went even paler than Kendra. "And I think you know exactly who I am, Nurse Barlow. So let me ask you again. Why is my wife, who came here in medical distress, sitting in a wheelchair in your waiting room instead of receiving treatment?" The way he said her name, Nurse Barlow, made it clear he'd already been briefed, already knew exactly who he was dealing with, already had information that made Kendra's position substantially more precarious than she'd realized. "Your wife claimed she was having an emergency," Kendra said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "But in my professional judgment, your professional judgment," Adrian's voice remained quiet, controlled, but it cut like a scalpel. "Your professional judgment was to slap a pregnant woman in your emergency room? That's not... I was defending myself. I have video," Ramon said from the corner, stepping forward with his phone extended. "Complete video from the moment Mrs. Harper entered this hospital. Would you like to see it, sir?" The air seemed to leave Kendra's lungs in a rush. Around them, other witnesses were already speaking up, voices overlapping. She was horrible to her from the start, made her wait while other people went ahead, called her all kinds of names, hit her right in front of all of us. Dr. Chen, the administrator, looked like he might be sick. "Someone get Mrs. Harper to labor and delivery immediately," he said, his voice sharp with panic. "And someone explain to me what the hell happened here." "I can explain what happened," Dr. Park said, still standing protectively beside Nia's wheelchair. "What happened is that Nurse Barlow denied triage to a pregnant patient with 3rd trimester bleeding, verbally abused her for 35 minutes, physically assaulted her, and threatened my job when I tried to intervene." "That's not true," Kendra tried, but her voice sounded hollow now, the words automatic and unconvincing even to her own ears. Adrian knelt beside Nia's wheelchair, his hands finding hers, his eyes scanning her face. "I'm here now, baby," he said softly, all the steel in his voice melting into tenderness. "I've got you. Everything's going to be okay." "The baby," Nia gasped through another contraction. "Adrian, something's wrong." "We're going to take care of it," he promised. Then he looked up at Dr. Park. "Get my wife to L&D, now. I don't care what protocols exist. Get her the best care in this hospital right this second." "Already on it," Dr. Park said, beginning to push the wheelchair toward the double doors. Kendra made one last attempt to assert her authority, stepping into their path. "Nobody goes anywhere until we've documented." Adrian stood slowly, drawing himself to his full height, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of not just personal fury, but institutional power. "Let me be very clear about something, Nurse Barlow. My name is Adrian Harper. I'm the mayor of this city. The woman you assaulted is my wife, Nia Harper. The baby whose life you endangered is my daughter. And right now, every second you spend blocking her treatment is another second I spend remembering exactly what you did and exactly how I'm going to make sure you answer for it." The color drained from Kendra's face so completely she looked like she might faint. She stepped aside, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly. Dr. Park didn't wait for further permission. She pushed Nia's wheelchair through the double doors, calling out orders to nurses who suddenly materialized with the urgency that should have been present 35 minutes ago. Adrian followed close behind, one hand on his wife's shoulder, but his voice carried back to the waiting room with absolute clarity. "Someone call my office," he said to the woman with the briefcase. "Get the city attorney down here, and someone make sure not one piece of video evidence disappears. Not one witness leaves without giving a statement. Not one document gets altered or destroyed. This is now an official investigation and nothing gets swept under the rug." In the hallway, Nia's body contracted again, hard enough that she cried out, hard enough that blood began to seep through her clothes onto the wheelchair. Dr. Park broke into a run, shouting for an OB team, and Adrian kept pace beside them, his hand never leaving his wife's, his voice a steady anchor in the storm. "Hold on," he kept saying. "Hold on, sweetheart. Our baby girl is strong. You're strong. Just hold on." Behind them, the waiting room erupted into chaos. Security trying to contain witnesses who refused to be contained. Dr. Chen on his phone making frantic calls. Kendra Barlow standing frozen in the center of it all as her carefully constructed world began to collapse around her like a building whose foundation had finally given way. And somewhere in that chaos, Ramon Vega looked down at his phone, at the video he'd captured, and made a decision. His thumb moved over the screen, uploading the footage to social media with a simple caption. "This is what happens at Metropolitan General when you're pregnant and black and ask for help. Watch what this nurse did. The whole world needs to see this." By the time Nia Harper was being rushed into an emergency C-section, her baby's heartbeat dropping into dangerous territory, that video had already been shared 200 times. By morning, it would be 2 million. And by the end of the week, nothing at Metropolitan General Hospital would ever be the same again. But right now, in an operating room flooded with urgent light and controlled panic, none of that mattered. Right now, the only thing that mattered was a mother fighting for her daughter's life, a husband praying harder than he'd ever prayed before, and doctors working with desperate precision to save them both while the clock ticked down and the margins for error grew smaller with every passing second. The night was far from over. The reckoning had only just begun. The operating room lights were merciless in their brightness, turning everything they touched into sharp relief. The gleaming instruments laid out with surgical precision, the monitors tracking heartbeats and oxygen levels with electronic vigilance, the faces of the medical team masked, but eyes betraying various degrees of controlled urgency. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the OB/GYN who'd been pulled from her bed at 3:47 a.m., worked with the kind of focused intensity that came from 20 years of delivering babies in crisis situations, her hands steady even as the monitors began their insistent warning beep. "Fetal heart rate dropping," the anesthesiologist called out, her voice professionally neutral despite the concerning numbers. "We're at 92 and falling." "I see it," Dr. Mitchell said, her scalpel moving with practiced confidence through layers of tissue. "Almost there. Talk to me about Mom's vitals." "BP stable, oxygen sat 98%, another voice responded. "She's holding steady." Nia lay on the table, her body draped and prepped, her consciousness floating in that strange twilight space between awareness and sedation. The spinal block had taken away the physical pain but left her mind horrifyingly alert, able to hear every word, every beep, every tense exchange between the people working to save her daughter. Adrian stood beside her head, still in his street clothes covered by a hastily donned surgical gown, his hand gripping hers with enough force that she could feel his fear through his fingertips. "You're doing great, baby," he kept whispering, his voice cracking despite his efforts to sound strong. "Lyric's going to be fine. You're both going to be fine." But Nia could hear what he heard. That monitor's persistent alarm, that dropping number that represented her daughter's struggling heart, that controlled urgency in the medical team's movements that suggested they were racing against something invisible and implacable. She wanted to ask questions, but her tongue felt thick, her thoughts sluggish, fear and medication combining into a paralysis that left her trapped inside her own body, while strangers worked to extract her child. Heart rate at 85, the anesthesiologist announced, and now there was an edge to her professional calm. Doctor, I know, Dr. Mitchell said tersely. 30 seconds. Maybe less. Someone page the NICU team. Tell them we're going to need immediate intervention. Those words, immediate intervention, landed on Nia like stones. Her baby was dying. Her daughter, who she'd felt moving just hours ago, who she'd sung to and talked to and imagined holding, was somewhere inside her struggling for life while Nia lay helpless and cut open, unable to do anything but listen to numbers fall and prayers go unanswered. Got her, Dr. Mitchell said suddenly, her voice changing to something closer to relief. Suctioning now. Come on, sweetheart, come on. The silence that followed was the longest of Nia's life. No crying, no sound, except the continued electronic monitoring and the soft, urgent murmurs of medical professionals doing things she couldn't see, working on a baby she hadn't yet laid eyes on, making decisions about life and death in a space measured in seconds. Adrian's hand tightened around hers until it hurt, but Nia welcomed the pain. It was something to focus on, something real and immediate in a moment that felt like it might fracture into nightmare at any second. Then, thin, reedy but unmistakably present, came the sound of a newborn's cry. There we go, Dr. Mitchell said, and Nia could hear the smile in her voice even through the mask. That's what we want to hear. Okay, she's breathing on her own, but she's small and distressed. NICU is standing by. Can I? Nia's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat tight with emotion and medication. Can I see her? There was a moment of consultation, low voices discussing protocols and risks, and then a nurse appeared in Nia's limited field of vision, carrying a tiny bundle that looked impossibly small against the woman's capable hands. Just a glimpse, dark hair plastered to a little head, skin that looked almost translucent in its delicacy, miniature fingers curled into fists, a face scrunched with the outrage of premature birth. She's beautiful, the nurse said softly, angling the baby so both parents could see. 4 pounds, 3 ounces, 32 weeks exactly. She's a fighter. Lyric, Nia breathed, tears streaming down her temples into her hair. That's Lyric. Hello, Lyric Harper, Adrian said, his voice breaking completely now, all pretense of stoic strength abandoned in the face of his daughter's fragile existence. We've been waiting for you, baby girl. But the moment was brief. The NICU team was already there, ready to whisk Lyric away to an environment controlled and monitored, where her premature lungs could be supported, and her tiny body could be given every possible advantage. Nia watched her daughter disappear through the operating room doors, watched Adrian's face torn between staying with his wife and following his child, watched everything she'd imagined about this moment. The skin-to-skin contact, the first feeding, the golden hour of bonding evaporate like mist under harsh lights. Go, Nia told Adrian, the word costing her everything. Go with her. Don't let her be alone. Adrian looked down at his wife, at her brave face and terrified eyes, and then at the doors through which his daughter had just vanished, pulled in 2 directions by love that felt strong enough to tear him apart. I'll stay with your wife, Dr. Mitchell said quietly, understanding the impossible choice she was witnessing. And I'll send updates the second anything changes. But your daughter should have family with her. Adrian bent and pressed his forehead against Nia's, a moment of connection in the chaos. I love you, he whispered. I'll take care of our girl until you can. Then he was gone, following the NICU team, and Nia was left with the strange sensation of her body being sutured and cleaned while her mind floated somewhere else entirely, replaying the last 4 hours in jagged fragments, the cramping that had woken her, the drive to the hospital, Kendra Barlow's face twisted with contempt, the waiting, the pleading, the humiliation, the slap that echoed through her memory louder than it had sounded in reality, the water breaking and the contractions and the desperate phone call to Adrian, and now Lyric, born too soon, too small, fighting for stability in a NICU incubator while her mother lay opened and empty, separated by walls and circumstances that felt as impassable as continents. You did everything right, Dr. Mitchell said softly, her hands working with steady competence. I want you to know that. Everything you described to me, coming to the ER when you felt something wrong, advocating for yourself and your baby, calling for help when you weren't being heard. You did exactly what you should have done. What happened to you tonight was inexcusable, and none of it was your fault. Nia couldn't respond, couldn't trust herself to speak without completely falling apart, so she just closed her eyes and let the tears come, while strangers finished the work of putting her body back together, even as her heart remained shattered and scattered between this operating room and wherever her daughter was fighting to breathe. 3 floors down, in the main administrative wing that was rarely occupied at this hour, a very different kind of operation was underway. The conference room that hospital leadership usually reserved for quarterly board meetings had been hastily converted into something resembling a war room, fluorescent lights blazing, coffee brewing in the corner, and people in various states of professional dress gathering with the grim urgency of a crisis in progress. Dr. Robert Chen stood at the head of the conference table, his silver hair disheveled from where he'd run his hands through it repeatedly, his tie loosened, his expensive suit jacket abandoned over a chair. Around him sat the hospital's legal counsel, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Vance, who'd been practicing medical malpractice defense for 30 years and recognized a disaster when she saw one. Beside her, the hospital's chief nursing officer, Margaret Torres, looked like she'd aged a decade in the past hour. The head of security, a former police captain named James Reeves, had his laptop open and was already reviewing footage from multiple camera angles. And at the far end of the table, still in his jeans and jacket over scrubs, sat Mayor Adrian Harper with the city attorney, Elena Rodriguez, and 2 police officers who'd accompanied him to the hospital and now stood as witnesses to everything that had unfolded. "Let me make sure I understand the timeline," Patricia Vance said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone assembling facts that would inevitably become evidence. Mrs. Nia Harper, 32 weeks pregnant, arrived at Metropolitan General's emergency room at approximately 3:03 a.m., presenting with cramping and spotting. She was initially processed by charge nurse Kendra Barlow and instructed to wait. Is that correct so far? That's correct, Dr. Chen said, though his voice suggested he wished it wasn't. And according to multiple witness statements we've collected in the past hour, as well as video evidence captured by patients and staff, Mrs. Harper waited approximately 35 minutes, during which time her condition worsened. She made multiple attempts to request care, and Nurse Barlow not only refused to expedite her triage, but verbally abused her and ultimately physically assaulted her. Is that also correct? The silence in the room was heavy enough to sink ships. Dr. Chen's face had gone gray. "There is video evidence of the assault," James Reeves said quietly, turning his laptop so everyone could see. "Hospital security footage, plus recordings from multiple witnesses. It's unambiguous." Patricia watched the footage with the expression of someone watching a train derail in slow motion. Horrified but unable to look away, already calculating the damage, already knowing that no amount of legal maneuvering would make this disappear. The video showed everything: Kendra's dismissive treatment, Nia's increasingly desperate pleas, Dr. Park's intervention, and then, clear as daylight despite the grainy quality, Kendra's hand connecting with Nia's face in a slap that would be replayed on news broadcasts and social media feeds for weeks to come. "Jesus Christ," Patricia breathed. "How long have we employed Nurse Barlow?" 9 years, Margaret Torres said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked ill. 9 years, and I swear to God we've never had a complaint like this. Never? Elena Rodriguez, the city attorney, raised an eyebrow. Not one complaint in 9 years? That seems statistically unlikely for any healthcare worker. There was a pause, heavy with implication. Margaret's face tightened. There have been complaints, she admitted, but nothing that rose to the level of... Nothing that seemed to warrant... How many complaints? Adrian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. It was the first time he'd spoken since the meeting began, and everyone turned to look at him. How many complaints were there about Nurse Barlow that you decided didn't warrant action? Margaret looked down at her hands. Over the years? Perhaps a dozen? Maybe 15. But they were always... The situations were always ambiguous. Personality conflicts, differences in communication styles. Nothing that clearly indicated racism, Adrian finished for her. Discrimination? Abuse of power? Because let me tell you what I saw tonight, Ms. Torres. I saw a woman in a position of authority systematically degrade, humiliate, and ultimately physically assault my wife while she was in medical distress. And I saw it happen in a way that suggested this wasn't her first time wielding her power as a weapon against someone she deemed unworthy of basic human decency. Mayor Harper, Patricia Vance began, her voice conciliatory, I understand you're upset. Upset? Adrian's laugh was bitter. My wife was assaulted while begging for help for our daughter. My daughter was born 2 months premature and is currently in the NICU fighting to stabilize. Upset doesn't begin to cover what I am. What I am is looking at clear evidence of discrimination, assault, and medical negligence, and I'm listening to hospital administration try to soft pedal this by talking about personality conflicts and ambiguous situations. We're not trying to minimize anything, Dr. Chen said, but he sounded defensive. We're trying to understand how this happened so we can... I'll tell you how it happened, Elena Rodriguez interrupted, her voice sharp. It happened because complaints were filed and dismissed. It happened because someone with a pattern of problematic behavior was allowed to continue in a position of power over vulnerable patients. It happened because the systems that should have caught this failed repeatedly. And now we're sitting here at 4:30 in the morning dealing with the consequences. James Reeves cleared his throat. There's something else you should know. One of the witnesses, a janitor named Ramon Vega, uploaded his video to social media about 20 minutes ago. It's already gone viral. We're talking hundreds of thousands of views and climbing. The press is going to be all over this by morning. Patricia Vance closed her eyes briefly, the gesture of someone accepting an inevitable catastrophe. Of course it is. Dr. Chen, where's Nurse Barlow now? Security is holding her in a conference room on the second floor, James said. She's requesting to speak with her union representative. That's her right, Patricia acknowledged. But before anyone speaks with her, I need to be very clear about something. This hospital is facing potential criminal charges, civil liability, and a public relations nightmare that could take years to recover from. Every action we take in the next 24 hours will be scrutinized by the media, the courts, and the community. So we need to be absolutely certain we're doing this by the book. What are you recommending? Dr. Chen asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer and wasn't going to like it. Immediate suspension without pay pending a full investigation, Patricia said. Full cooperation with police if they choose to file criminal charges. Complete transparency with the Harper family and their legal representation, and frank acknowledgement that what happened here was unacceptable and will result in consequences. She'll fight it, Margaret said. The union will fight it. They'll argue that there wasn't proper documentation, that the suspension is premature, that... Let them fight, Adrian said, his voice hard as stone. Let them argue in front of cameras while the entire world watches video of a nurse slapping a pregnant woman who is begging for help. Let them explain to a jury why documented complaints were ignored for years. Let them try to defend the indefensible. He stood slowly, drawing himself to his full height, and when he spoke again, his voice carried not just personal fury, but the weight of political power and public accountability. I came here tonight as a husband and a father, he said, but I'm also the mayor of this city. And what happened to my wife tonight isn't just a personal tragedy. It's a symptom of systemic failures that put every patient who walks through these doors at risk. So here's what's going to happen. The city is going to conduct a full investigation of Metropolitan General's emergency department. We're going to review every complaint filed against every staff member for the past 5 years. We're going to audit your triage protocols, your training programs, your oversight mechanisms. And we're going to do it with full transparency and public reporting. Mayor Harper, Dr. Chen started, his voice strained. I don't think you have the authority to... I have the authority to ensure patient safety in publicly funded healthcare facilities. Adrian cut him off. I have the authority to investigate discrimination in institutions that receive city contracts. And I have the authority to use every legal means at my disposal to make sure what happened to my wife never happens to anyone else. So you can cooperate willingly, or you can fight me and discover exactly how much political capital I'm willing to spend on this issue. Your choice. The room fell silent. Patricia Vance looked at Dr. Chen with an expression that clearly communicated what her professional opinion was. Cooperate, accept the consequences, and hoped to limit the damage. Fighting would only make things worse. "We'll cooperate," Dr. Chen finally said, his shoulders sagging with defeat. "Fully and completely. We'll suspend Nurse Barlow immediately. We'll open all records to investigation, and we'll implement whatever reforms are recommended. This hospital has served this community for 70 years. We're not going to let one person's actions destroy that legacy." One person's actions that you enabled by ignoring complaints and failing to properly supervise your staff, Elena Rodriguez pointed out. "But it's a start. I'll have preliminary requests for documentation on your desk by end of business today. And Mayor Harper will need to recuse himself from certain aspects of the investigation given his personal involvement, but the city attorney's office will ensure continuity." Adrian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and his entire demeanor shifted. The political figure receding, the terrified father surging forward. "I have to go," he said abruptly. "That's the ICU. They said Lyric's numbers are improving, but they want me there." He left without waiting for dismissal or further discussion, leaving behind a room full of people facing the wreckage of a night that had started as routine and ended with everything changed. Patricia Vance was already drafting preliminary legal strategies. Margaret Torres was pulling up personnel files on Kendra Barlow, finally looking at complaints that had been filed and dismissed with fresh eyes that saw patterns she'd missed or chosen to ignore. James Reeves was liaising with the police officers about criminal investigation protocols. And 2 floors up, in a small conference room with no windows and a security guard outside the door, Kendra Barlow sat alone with her phone confiscated and her career disintegrating around her like ash. She'd tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to frame what had happened as a misunderstanding or self-defense or anything other than what it actually was. But even she could hear how hollow the words sounded, how impossible it would be to unsee what dozens of people had witnessed and multiple cameras had recorded. She'd spent 15 years building authority, earning respect, establishing herself as someone who didn't take nonsense from difficult patients who thought they could demand special treatment. She'd seen herself as a gatekeeper, someone who maintained order in chaos, someone who made the hard calls that softer colleagues couldn't handle. She'd believed her own narrative so completely that she'd never stopped to examine what that narrative actually meant. Who paid the price for her version of order, whose suffering she'd dismissed as dramatics, whose humanity she'd eroded one interaction at a time. Now, sitting in this room with fluorescent lights that made her skin look sallow and walls that seemed to be closing in, Kendra was beginning to understand that her story was being rewritten by people who'd never seen her as a hero, maintaining standards, but as a villain, abusing power. And the worst part, the part that was starting to creep through her defenses like cold water through cracks, was the possibility that they were right. In the NICU, Adrian stood beside an incubator that looked like something from a science fiction film. All clear plastic and sophisticated monitoring equipment and tubes connecting his daughter to machines that were doing work her premature body couldn't yet manage alone. Lyric lay on her back, her tiny chest rising and falling with assisted breaths, her eyes closed, her miniature hands curled near her face. She was wearing a diaper that looked impossibly small and a knitted cap that one of the NICU nurses had placed over her dark hair. Wires and tubes emerged from her small body like the world's most delicate puppet strings, monitoring heart rate and oxygen and a dozen other values that Adrian was learning to read with desperate focus. "Her stats are improving," the NICU doctor, a young woman named Dr. Patel with kind eyes and capable hands, told him quietly. "Her oxygen saturation is holding steady at 94%. Her heart rate has stabilized at 140, and she's maintaining her temperature well. Those are all excellent signs for a 32-weeker. "But she's so small," Adrian said, his voice rough with emotion. "She's so small and there are so many wires and—" "I know it looks frightening," Dr. Patel said gently, "but I promise you, this is what we do. Babies born at 32 weeks have excellent outcomes with proper support. Lyric's already showing us she's strong. She's breathing over the ventilator, which means her lungs are working. She's responsive to stimulation. All of her initial labs look good. She just needs time to grow and develop outside the womb instead of inside." Adrian nodded, not trusting himself to speak, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. She was the most beautiful and most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. This tiny person who existed against odds, who'd been forced into the world too soon by circumstances that never should have happened, who'd already survived more in her first hours than some people faced in a lifetime. "Can I touch her?" he asked. "Of course. In fact, we encourage it. Even though she's premature, she can still benefit from her parents' touch and voice. Just open that porthole door and you can put your hand inside. Gentle but firm. Premature babies actually prefer a steady touch to light stroking, which can feel overwhelming to them." Adrian carefully opened the small circular door built into the side of the incubator and reached in with a hand that suddenly seemed enormous and clumsy compared to his daughter's delicate form. He placed his palm over her body, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat, the shallow rise and fall of her breathing, the impossible warmth of her skin. "Hey, Lyric," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It's your daddy. I'm right here, baby girl. Your mama's going to be here soon, too. We're both so sorry you had to come out before you were ready, but you're safe now. You're going to be okay. We're all going to be okay." Lyric's face scrunched slightly, her mouth making small movements, her body responding to his voice and touch even in her sedated state. Adrian watched, mesmerized, as his daughter's tiny hand moved and somehow, impossibly, found his finger and wrapped around it with a grip that was weak but unmistakable. That's when he broke. All the control he'd maintained through the crisis, all the authority he'd wielded in that conference room, all the strength he'd shown for Nia in the operating room. It all dissolved in the face of his daughter's fragile grip on his finger. He bent forward, his forehead resting against the side of the incubator, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I've got you," he whispered through tears. "Daddy's got you. Nothing's ever going to hurt you again. I promise." Dr. Patel stepped back quietly, giving him privacy with his daughter, understanding that some moments were sacred and some promises were made not because they could be kept absolutely, but because they had to be spoken aloud to have meaning. Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the city, pale light creeping across buildings and streets, transforming the world from night to morning in gradual degrees. Emergency room shifts were changing, day staff arriving to find their workplace transformed into something resembling a crime scene, whispers and rumors spreading through the hospital, faster than any official communication could travel. The video Ramon Vega had uploaded was now approaching 1 million views, spawning reaction videos and news articles, trending on multiple platforms, being discussed in living rooms and offices and online forums across the country. And in a recovery room on the 4th floor, Nia Harper lay in a hospital bed with an empty womb and full arms, nurses having finally brought her the updates she'd been desperately waiting for. Lyric was stable, Adrian was with her, and as soon as Nia was cleared by her surgical team, she could go see her daughter for herself. But for now, she lay in this strange liminal space between crisis and recovery, between fear and hope, between the violence of what had been done to her and the possibility of justice that might follow. Her body ached from surgery, her heart ached from separation, and her mind kept replaying that moment, Kendra's hand rising, the sharp crack of impact, the shock that had been almost worse than the pain. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Dr. Elise Park stepped inside, still in her scrubs from the ER shift, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like guilt. "Mrs. Harper," she said quietly, "I wanted to come check on you, and I wanted to apologize." "You have nothing to apologize for," Nia said, her voice still hoarse from intubation. "You tried to help me. You were the only one who tried." "I should have done more," Dr. Park said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I should have insisted. I should have gotten someone else involved earlier. I should have—" "You were being threatened with your career," Nia interrupted gently. "I heard what Nurse Barlow said to you. You still tried to help me, even knowing what it might cost you. That took courage." Dr. Park shook her head. "Not enough courage. Not fast enough. Your baby is in the NICU because I didn't act quickly enough to get you the care you needed." "My baby is in the NICU because Kendra Barlow chose cruelty over compassion," Nia said firmly, "because she saw a black woman asking for help and decided I deserved humiliation instead. That's not on you. That's on her and on every system that enabled her behavior for years." They sat in silence for a moment, two women processing trauma in different ways, both understanding that what had happened in that emergency room was bigger than one night and one nurse, that it represented something systemic and ugly that had been allowed to fester beneath professional surfaces and polite protocols. "I gave a full statement to the hospital administration," Dr. Park finally said. "Everything I witnessed, everything she said, everything that happened. And I told them about other times I've seen her treat patients poorly. Nothing as extreme as tonight, but a pattern of dismissiveness and rudeness that I'd noticed but never formally reported. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." "You're speaking up now," Nia said. "That matters. That's going to matter for the next person who walks into that ER needing help." Dr. Park nodded, wiping at her eyes. "They suspended her. Nurse Barlow, effective immediately, pending investigation, and there's talk of criminal charges." "Good," Nia said, and was surprised by the vehemence in her own voice. "Good. Because what she did to me, what she's probably been doing to other patients for years, it can't just be swept away as a bad night or a misunderstanding. She hit me. She denied me medical care. She endangered my daughter. Those are crimes, not mistakes." "I know," Dr. Park said softly, "and I promise you, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure this leads to real change. In the ER, in the hospital, in how we treat patients, and how we respond to complaints. This can't happen again." After Dr. Park left, Nia lay back against her pillows and closed her eyes, exhaustion finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had kept her alert through crisis. But even as sleep pulled at her consciousness, her mind kept circling back to one thought: her daughter, small and struggling in a NICU incubator, fighting to breathe and grow and thrive despite being forced into the world before she was ready. "Hold on, Lyric," Nia whispered into the empty room. "Mama's coming soon. Just hold on, baby girl." 3 floors down, in that conference room where Kendra still sat in isolation, a knock finally came at the door. She looked up with something like hope. Perhaps this was all going to be resolved. Perhaps once she explained properly, they'd understand. Perhaps her union representative was here to fix this mess. But when the door opened, it was Patricia Vance, the hospital's attorney, accompanied by Margaret Torres and a woman Kendra didn't recognize wearing a police uniform and carrying a badge. "Ms. Barlow," Patricia said, her voice professionally neutral. "This is Detective Sarah Chen from the City Police Department. She has some questions for you regarding the events of this evening. You have the right to remain silent and to have an attorney present during questioning. Do you understand these rights?" And with those words, Kendra finally understood that this wasn't going to be fixed or explained away or resolved with a reprimand and a warning. This was the beginning of consequences. Real, legal, career-ending consequences that stretched out before her like a road with no visible end. The night that had started with a pregnant woman walking through automatic doors asking for help had transformed into something none of them could have predicted. A reckoning that would ripple through lives and institutions, exposing ugly truths that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. Detective Sarah Chen had been a police officer for 18 years, long enough to recognize when someone was preparing to lie and when they were simply terrified of the truth. As she sat across from Kendra Barlow in the sterile conference room, watching the nurse's hands tremble slightly despite her attempts at composure, Sarah saw both. Kendra's eyes kept darting to the door as if calculating escape routes, her jaw set in that particular way people adopted when they'd convinced themselves they were the victim in a story where the evidence suggested otherwise. "Ms. Barlow," Sarah began, her voice carrying neither sympathy nor hostility, just the flat professional tone of someone who'd conducted hundreds of these interviews and knew that facts would speak louder than emotion. "I need to ask you about the events that occurred in the emergency room between approximately 3:03 and 3:45 a.m. this morning, specifically regarding your interactions with patient Nia Harper. Before we begin, I want to confirm that you understand your rights and that you're choosing to speak with me without an attorney present." "I understand my rights," Kendra said, her voice tight. "And I don't need a lawyer because I didn't do anything wrong. That woman, Mrs. Harper, she was aggressive and threatening, and I was defending myself according to hospital protocol for dealing with combative patients." Sarah made a note on her pad, her face revealing nothing. "Can you describe Mrs. Harper's aggressive behavior?" "She was demanding immediate treatment, refusing to wait her turn, getting loud and confrontational when I explained our triage procedures." Kendra's words came faster now, like she'd been rehearsing this version of events and needed to get it out, before doubt could creep in. She kept interrupting me, kept insisting she was more important than other patients, kept implying that I was discriminating against her. That's when she became physically aggressive and I had to defend myself. Physically aggressive how, specifically? Kendra hesitated, perhaps remembering the cameras, the witnesses, the phones that had been recording. She lunged toward me. Over the desk, I felt threatened and I reacted instinctively. With an open-handed slap to her face, the words hung in the air like an accusation, because that's exactly what they were. Kendra's composure cracked slightly, her hands twisting together on the table. "I was defending myself," she repeated, but the conviction had leaked out of her voice. "I'm a woman alone at a desk in the middle of the night dealing with a patient who was becoming increasingly hostile. I had the right to protect myself." Sarah flipped through her notebook, though she already knew what she'd written there. Witness statements collected from the construction worker, the elderly woman with oxygen, the college student, a handful of other patients who'd been in that waiting room. Ramon Vega's testimony about everything he'd recorded. Dr. Elise Park's detailed account of the confrontation and Kendra's threats, and the video footage from multiple angles that contradicted virtually everything Kendra had just claimed. "Ms. Barlow, I've reviewed security footage from the emergency room as well as recordings from multiple witnesses. In none of those recordings does Mrs. Harper lunge toward you or make any aggressive physical movements. In fact, the footage shows her standing still, speaking calmly despite visible distress, with both hands on her pregnant belly. At no point does she move toward you in a threatening manner before you strike her. Would you like to revise your statement?" Kendra's face went pale, then flushed with something that could have been embarrassment or anger or both. "Those cameras don't show everything. They don't show her attitude, her tone of voice, the way she was looking at me." "Attitude and tone of voice don't constitute assault," Sarah interrupted quietly. "And even if they did, hospital security footage includes audio. Would you like me to play back what Mrs. Harper actually said during your interactions?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Kendra's jaw worked like she was chewing on words she couldn't quite bring herself to speak, defenses crumbling as she realized that the story she'd constructed, the narrative where she was the protector, the professional, the one enforcing reasonable boundaries against an unreasonable patient, didn't match the objective record of what had actually happened. "Why did you hit her?" Sarah asked, and this time her voice carried something closer to genuine curiosity than accusation. "I've read your personnel file. 15 years in nursing, generally positive evaluations, no previous incidents of physical violence against patients. So what was different about this night? What was different about this patient?" Kendra looked down at her hands, and when she spoke, her voice was smaller, more honest, stripped of the defensive bluster. She wouldn't stop. She kept asking and asking, kept acting like the rules didn't apply to her, kept making me feel like I was the bad guy for doing my job. And then that resident, Dr. Park, she comes out questioning my judgment, acting like she knows better than me when I've been doing this longer than she's been out of medical school. Everyone was looking at me like I was the villain when I was just trying to maintain order. "So you hit a pregnant woman because she made you feel like a villain?" "No, Kendra's voice cracked. "I don't know. It happened so fast. She was standing there crying and pleading, and everyone was looking at me with these judgmental faces, and I snapped. For 1 second, I just wanted her to stop, wanted everyone to stop looking at me like I was some kind of monster, and my hand moved before I could think about it." It was, Sarah recognized, probably the most honest thing Kendra had said since the interview began. Not an excuse, not a justification, but an acknowledgement that something in that moment had broken through her professional control and revealed something uglier underneath. "Ms. Barlow, I need to ask you something else. Multiple witnesses reported that during your interactions with Mrs. Harper, you made comments that suggested racial bias. Comments about people like her seeking special treatment, assumptions about her insurance status and income level, remarks that witnesses interpreted as discriminatory. Can you explain those comments?" Kendra's face flushed darker. "I never said anything racist. I treat all my patients equally, regardless of—" "I'm going to stop you there," Sarah said, pulling out her phone and opening the video Ramon Vega had captured. She turned it so Kendra could see, pressed play, and let the nurse's own words fill the small conference room. The audio was clear enough to catch everything: the contempt in Kendra's voice, the specific phrases that carried unmistakable implications, the way she'd weaponized assumptions about Nia's identity and circumstances. Kendra watched her own performance with an expression that cycled through denial, horror, and something that might have been recognition, seeing herself through others' eyes for perhaps the first time, hearing how her words sounded without the internal justifications that had made them seem reasonable in the moment. "That's not," she started, then stopped. "I didn't mean it like that. I wasn't thinking about her race. I was just what?" Sarah asked, genuinely wanting to understand. "Because from where I'm sitting, you made assumptions about a patient based on her appearance, denied her appropriate medical care based on those assumptions, and became hostile when she advocated for herself. And then, when confronted with the consequences of your behavior, you physically assaulted her. Those are facts, Ms. Barlow. The question is whether those facts constitute criminal assault, discrimination, or both." Kendra put her head in her hands, her shoulders beginning to shake. It wasn't quite crying, more like the physical manifestation of someone's carefully constructed self-image collapsing under the weight of undeniable evidence. "I need a lawyer," she finally whispered. "I need to call my union representative." "That's your right," Sarah agreed, standing and gathering her materials. "But Ms. Barlow, I want you to understand something before I leave this room. That baby, Lyric Harper, she's in the NICU right now, born 2 months premature, fighting to stabilize because her mother's pleas for help were ignored for 35 critical minutes. Whatever you meant or didn't mean, whatever you intended or didn't intend, that's the outcome. A premature baby struggling to breathe because the person whose job was to help her mother decided that help wasn't warranted. That's what you need to live with." She left Kendra alone with that thought, emerging into the hallway where Patricia Vance and Margaret Torres waited with identical expressions of grim resignation. "She's asking for representation," Sarah told them, "which means my questioning is done for now, but I have enough to recommend charges. Assault, at minimum, possibly reckless endangerment depending on how the DA's office wants to proceed. And based on the evidence of discriminatory statements, there may be additional civil rights violations to consider." "The hospital is prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation," Patricia said, though she looked like the words cost her something. "We've already suspended Ms. Barlow without pay. Her nursing license will be reported to the state board for review and potential revocation." "What about the complaints?" Sarah asked. "Dr. Park mentioned there were previous incidents that weren't properly addressed." Margaret Torres flinched like the question was a physical blow. "We're pulling all personnel records now. Every complaint filed against Ms. Barlow over the past 9 years. It's becoming clear that there were warning signs we should have caught, patterns we should have recognized. I take full responsibility for that failure and oversight." "Taking responsibility is a start," Sarah said, her tone skeptical. "But responsibility without consequence is just words. The real question is what changes to ensure this doesn't happen again." She walked away before either of them could respond, making her way through the hospital's maze of corridors toward the NICU where she'd been told the Harper family could be found. She had more questions, needed formal statements, but she also understood that some things took precedence over police procedure. A family in crisis deserved time to be a family before they had to be witnesses and victims and participants in the legal machinery that would grind forward whether they wanted it to or not. The NICU was quieter than the rest of the hospital, all hushed voices and dimmed lights, and the soft electronic beeping of machines monitoring tiny lives. Sarah found Adrian Harper still standing beside the same incubator where he'd been for the past 2 hours, his hand inside the plastic portal, his daughter's impossibly small fingers wrapped around one of his. "Mr. Mayor," Sarah said softly, not wanting to startle him. "I'm Detective Chen. I'm so sorry to intrude, but I need to ask you some questions when you have a moment." Adrian looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but focused, his face showing the particular kind of exhaustion that came from sustained fear, gradually giving way to cautious hope. "She's stable," he said, like those words were the only ones that mattered right now. "Her oxygen levels are good, her heart rate is steady, and they're talking about weaning her off the ventilator in a few days if she continues progressing. The doctor said she's already exceeding expectations for a 32-weeker. "That's wonderful news," Sarah said, and meant it. She'd worked enough cases involving children, endangered, injured, lost, to genuinely appreciate when one of those stories bent toward survival instead of tragedy. Your wife must be incredibly relieved. She's being brought up in about an hour, as soon as they clear her from post-op recovery. She hasn't been able to see Lyric yet, hasn't been able to hold her. His voice broke slightly. That's what's killing her almost as much as the fear. Missing those first hours, being separated when they should be together. Sarah nodded, giving him a moment to compose himself before continuing. I've just finished interviewing Nurse Barlow. I wanted to let you know that I'll be recommending assault charges be filed. The video evidence is clear and unambiguous, and her own statements contradict the physical facts. There may be additional charges depending on the DA's review. Good, Adrian said, his voice hard. Because what she did, what the hospital allowed her to do for years, it can't be dismissed as a difficult situation or a personality conflict. She assaulted my wife. She endangered my daughter. And based on what I'm hearing, she's been mistreating vulnerable patients for years while administration looked the other way. About that, Sarah said carefully. I know you're planning a city investigation into the hospital's practices. I need to make sure that investigation doesn't interfere with the criminal case or give defense attorneys grounds to claim bias or political interference. I've already discussed it with the city attorney, Adrian assured her. I'm recusing myself from direct involvement given the conflict of interest. Elena Rodriguez will oversee the administrative review, and it will be conducted independently of the criminal investigation. But I'm not going to apologize for using whatever authority I have to ensure this hospital is held accountable for systemic failures that put patients at risk. Sarah studied him for a moment. This man who existed in the strange intersection of victim, witness, and public official, who had personal fury and political power, and the self-awareness to understand how those things needed to be separated. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I think you're handling this with more restraint than most people would. If someone had done to my spouse what was done to yours, I'm not sure I'd be standing here having a calm conversation about jurisdictional boundaries and proper procedure. Adrian's laugh was bitter. I'm not calm. I'm furious. I'm so angry I can barely think straight. But I'm also a black man in America who knows that my anger, no matter how justified, will be used against me and my family if I let it control my actions. So I channel it, I direct it. I use it to fuel systemic change instead of individual revenge. Because revenge doesn't protect the next woman who walks into that ER needing help. Before Sarah could respond, a nurse approached. Not Dr. Patel, but another NICU staff member, a middle-aged black woman whose name tag identified her as Lorraine Matthews. Her face was kind, but serious. Mr. Harper? Mrs. Harper has been cleared to come up, and they're bringing her now. I thought you'd want to know so you could prepare Lyric for her mama's arrival. Babies know their mother's voice, even when they're this small. Adrian's entire demeanor transformed, professional control giving way to raw emotion. She's coming? Nia's coming now? Should be here in about 5 minutes. They're bringing her in a wheelchair since she's still post-op, but her vitals are stable and she's cleared for NICU visitation. I thought you might want to step out and meet her. Or if you'd rather wait here with your daughter, I can make sure they know which room to bring her to. I'll wait here, Adrian decided. I want to be with Lyric when Nia arrives, so she can see us both together, so she knows we're both okay. Lorraine smiled, the expression warm with understanding. That's beautiful. I'll make sure they bring Mrs. Harper directly to room 3. And Mr. Harper, I just want you to know what happened to your wife tonight, what that nurse did. It's not who we are. Most of us in this hospital, we got into healthcare because we wanted to help people, wanted to make a difference. I'm so sorry she encountered someone who forgot that. Thank you, Adrian said, his voice rough with gratitude for the acknowledgement. That means more than you know. Sarah excused herself quietly, understanding that she was about to witness something private and sacred. A family reunion born from trauma, parents meeting their daughter under circumstances that should never have happened. She'd get her formal statements later. Some moments needed to be protected from the machinery of justice. 3 minutes later, a nurse wheeled Nia into the NICU, and Adrian would later tell people that the expression on his wife's face in that moment was something he'd never forget. Terror and hope and desperate love all tangled together, her eyes scanning the room until they found the incubator where their daughter lay. Is she? Nia couldn't finish the question. her voice catching on fear too large to speak aloud. "She's okay," Adrian said quickly, moving to her wheelchair and taking her hands. "She's stable, baby. Her numbers are good. She's breathing on her own with just a little support. She's fighting hard, just like her mama." Nia closed her eyes briefly, tears streaming down her face, her entire body seeming to sag with relief. Then she opened them again, focusing on the incubator with an intensity that suggested nothing else in the world existed. "Can I see her? Can I touch her?" "Of course," Lorraine said gently, wheeling the chair closer to the incubator and positioning it so Nia could reach the portal door without straining her post-surgical body. "Just like this. Now open this little door here and you can put your hands right on her. She's been waiting for you." Nia's hands were shaking as she reached inside, her fingers finding her daughter's tiny body for the first time. The moment she made contact, something in her face shifted, a kind of peace settling over the anguish, connection reestablishing itself across the physical separation that surgery and circumstance had imposed. "Hi, baby girl," Nia whispered, her voice breaking. "Hi, Lyric, it's Mama. I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you right away. I'm so sorry you had to come out before you were ready, but I'm here now. I'm right here." As if responding to her mother's voice, Lyric's face moved, her tiny features scrunching in that way newborns did, her mouth making small, sucking movements. One miniature hand opened and closed, as if reaching for something just beyond grasp. Adrian stood behind Nia's wheelchair, his hands on her shoulders, both of them focused entirely on their daughter with the kind of concentrated attention that came from fear, finally giving way to fragile hope. For several long moments, no one spoke. There was only the soft beeping of monitors, the quiet whoosh of the ventilator, and the sound of two parents breathing in synchronization with their child. "She has your nose," Adrian finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "Look at that little nose. That's all you." "And your chin," Nia said, managing a watery smile. "That determined chin. She's going to be stubborn, just like her daddy." "She's going to be strong like her mama," Adrian countered. "Look at her. Born too early, thrust into the world by violence and negligence, and she's still here fighting. That's your strength in her, Nia, your resilience." Lorraine watched from a respectful distance, her professional eye monitoring both baby and mother, ready to intervene if needed, but understanding that sometimes the best medicine was simply connection, presence, love made tangible through touch. "Can I?" Nia hesitated, looking up at Lorraine with almost childlike hope. "I know she's on the ventilator and she needs to stay in the incubator, but is there any way I can hold her, even for a minute?" Lorraine's face softened with sympathy. "Not today, honey. I'm sorry. She needs the controlled environment right now while her lungs develop. But in a few days, if she continues stable, we can do what's called kangaroo care, skin-to-skin contact, where we place her directly on your chest. It's incredibly beneficial for preemies, helps regulate their temperature and heart rate, promotes bonding. We'll get you that time together, I promise." Nia nodded, swallowing disappointment, her hand still resting on her daughter's body like she could will health into her through sheer force of maternal love. "A few days. We can wait a few days. We've already waited this long." But as she sat there, watching her daughter breathe and struggle and persist, something darker crept into her awareness. Anger that had been submerged beneath fear now rising like floodwater. Everything that should have been different about this moment. The pregnancy that should have continued for 8 more weeks. The labor that should have been planned and supported. The first hours that should have been spent holding her daughter, instead of separated by walls and surgery and trauma. All of it stolen by one woman's cruelty and a system's indifference. "What's happening with her?" Nia asked quietly, her eyes still on Lyric, but her question clearly about someone else entirely. "With Nurse Barlow. Is she still working here? Could she walk into this NICU right now?" "She's been suspended," Adrian said, his voice hardening. "Detective Chen just told me she's recommending criminal charges. The hospital's conducting a full investigation. The city is conducting an independent review. She's not going to be able to hurt anyone else." "But she already did hurt people," Nia said. And now she looked up at her husband, her face showing something raw and furious beneath the tenderness she'd been directing at their daughter. "For years, apparently. all those complaints that were filed and ignored, all those other patients who probably encountered the same cruelty and didn't have a mayor for a husband, didn't have witnesses with cameras, didn't have the resources or connections to fight back. What happened to them? It was the question that would haunt everyone involved in the investigation over the coming weeks. How many other Nia Harpers had there been? How many patients had been dismissed and demeaned and endangered by someone whose behavior had been flagged repeatedly but never seriously addressed? The complaints that Margaret Torres had downplayed as personality conflicts now looked very different in light of video evidence and criminal charges, suggesting a pattern that had been visible all along to anyone willing to actually look. "We're going to find out," Adrian promised. "Every complaint, every incident, every warning sign that was ignored, it's all going to be reviewed. And the people who enabled her by looking the other way, who prioritized protecting staff over protecting patients, they're going to answer for their failures too." "It won't change what happened to us," Nia said softly. "It won't give Lyric the 8 weeks she should have had in the womb. It won't erase the memory of standing in that waiting room being treated like I was worthless while my baby was in distress." "No," Adrian agreed. "But it might protect someone else. It might mean the next Black woman who walks into that ER gets the care she deserves instead of being made to beg for basic human dignity." Nia turned back to the incubator, to her daughter whose tiny chest rose and fell with mechanical assistance, whose survival was a kind of miracle and a kind of tragedy all tangled together. "Then we fight," she said quietly. "We heal, we take care of our daughter, and we fight to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Not because it will fix what was broken, but because letting it continue unchallenged would be its own kind of violence." 8 floors below, in the hospital's main administration wing, that fight was already beginning in ways that would ripple through Metropolitan General for months to come. The conference room that had hosted the emergency meeting at dawn now held a different gathering. Department heads summoned from their Sunday morning routines, senior staff pulled from days off, everyone assembling with the grim awareness that they were about to discuss a crisis that would define their professional reputations for years. Dr. Robert Chen stood at the head of the table again, but his authority felt diminished now, tarnished by the knowledge that all of this had happened under his watch, had been preventable if only the right people had paid attention to the right warning signs. "I've asked you all here because we need to address what happened in our emergency room last night," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual confidence. "By now you've all seen the video that's circulating online. You've all heard about Nurse Barlow's suspension. What you might not know is the full extent of what we're facing: criminal investigation, civil liability exposure, city oversight, media scrutiny, and the very real possibility that our emergency department's reputation is permanently damaged." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the OB-GYN who'd delivered Lyric, spoke up from her seat near the middle of the table. "With respect, Dr. Chen, I think you're understating the problem. This isn't about reputation. This is about patient safety. A pregnant woman came to our facility in distress and was subjected to abuse that directly resulted in a premature delivery and endangered both mother and baby. That's not a PR problem. That's a fundamental failure of our mission." "I'm not dismissing the seriousness," Chen said, though his defensive tone suggested otherwise. "But we need to be strategic about how we respond. We need to protect the hospital while also addressing legitimate concerns about protect the hospital." The interruption came from Dr. James Wellington, a veteran ER physician who'd worked at Metropolitan for 30 years and whose weathered face suggested he'd seen enough to no longer care about political niceties. From what exactly? From accountability? From the consequences of enabling abusive behavior for years? Maybe the hospital doesn't deserve protection. Maybe it deserves exactly what's coming. The room fell silent, tension crackling between those who wanted to minimize and move on and those who understood that this moment demanded something more than damage control. Margaret Torres, the chief nursing officer who'd been notably quiet until now, finally spoke. "I've been reviewing Kendra Barlow's personnel file in detail since this morning. The complaints we received over the years, I need to own that I didn't take them seriously enough. I saw them as interpersonal conflicts, communication style differences, the kind of friction that happens in high-stress environments. I didn't see the pattern. Or maybe—" She paused, her voice catching. "Maybe I didn't want to see it, because seeing it would have required me to act, to confront someone with seniority and union protection, to potentially cause disruption in an already understaffed department, and that failure is on me. It's on all of us, Dr. Wellington said quietly. Every administrator who saw a complaint and filed it away. Every colleague who witnessed problematic behavior and said nothing. Every supervisor who prioritized operational efficiency over patient experience. We built a culture where someone like Kendra Barlow could thrive for 15 years because we valued order over compassion, because we protected staff over patients, because we treated complaints as annoyances instead of warnings. Patricia Vance, who'd been taking notes throughout the meeting, looked up with the expression of someone about to deliver very bad news. I need everyone in this room to understand the legal exposure we're facing. Based on the evidence I've reviewed, Mrs. Harper has grounds for a civil lawsuit that could result in significant damages: assault, discrimination, medical negligence, infliction of emotional distress. The fact that this occurred in our facility, by our employee, during working hours means we're liable. And if discovery reveals that we had knowledge of previous incidents and failed to act appropriately, that liability extends to punitive damages for reckless disregard of patient safety. How much are we talking? One of the department heads asked nervously. Conservatively? Multiple millions, and that's before considering the impact on our reputation, our ability to recruit staff, potential loss of insurance contracts, and the cost of implementing whatever reforms get mandated either through settlement or through the city's investigation. The numbers landed like physical blows, each person at the table calculating what this would mean for their department budgets, their programs, their jobs. But Dr. Wellington shook his head, rejecting the premise of the question. The cost of making this right is irrelevant, he said firmly. The question isn't, can we afford justice? It's, can we afford to remain an institution that enabled injustice? And the answer to that second question should be no, regardless of the financial impact. Easy for you to say when you're not responsible for keeping this hospital solvent, someone muttered. You know what's harder to keep solvent? Wellington shot back. A hospital that no one trusts. A facility that Black and brown patients avoid because they've learned, through stories like this one, that they won't receive equitable care. An emergency room that loses accreditation because investigators find systematic patterns of discrimination. That's what we're really risking here. Not just money. Our entire reason for existing. Dr. Chen raised his hands, trying to regain control of a meeting that was spiraling into territory he clearly hadn't anticipated. We're all on the same side here. We all want what's best for the hospital and for our patients. The question is how we move forward constructively. I'll tell you how we move forward, Margaret said, her voice stronger now as if she'd made some internal decision during the course of the conversation. We acknowledge every failure. We review every complaint against every staff member for patterns we missed. We implement mandatory implicit bias training for all patient-facing employees. We create transparent reporting mechanisms where patients can raise concerns without fear of retaliation. We establish independent oversight of triage decisions to ensure equity. And we do it all publicly, acknowledging what happened and committing to measurable change. Not because we're forced to, because it's right. That's a significant commitment, Patricia said carefully, and it potentially exposes us to additional liability if we're acknowledging past failures. Then we're exposed, Margaret said flatly. I've spent 30 years in nursing administration, and I thought I was good at my job, but I failed Nia Harper and everyone else who encountered Kendra Barlow and received less than the standard of care they deserved. I can't undo that, but I can make sure the next person who walks through our doors has a different experience. And if that costs me my job or this hospital money or whatever other consequences come, so be it. Some things matter more than institutional self-protection. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, working through logistics and legal strategies and implementation plans for reforms that felt both overwhelming and inadequate to the task of addressing decades of cultural problems. But something had shifted in that conference room, an acknowledgement that the institution itself was sick, that treating Kendra Barlow as an isolated problem rather than a symptom would be its own kind of lie. By late afternoon, Metropolitan General issued a public statement that surprised most observers with its candor. Rather than the carefully worded non-apology that usually characterized hospital responses to controversy, the statement acknowledged what had happened, committed to specific reforms with measurable timelines, and invited community input into the oversight process. It wasn't enough. Nothing could be enough in the face of what had been done, but it was a beginning. And 6 floors above where that statement was being drafted, Nia Harper sat beside her daughter's incubator, her hand resting on Lyric's tiny body, her mind already moving past the immediate crisis toward the longer fight that lay ahead. She was a teacher by training and calling, someone who'd spent her career trying to create environments where young people could thrive, regardless of the circumstances they'd been born into. Now she had a different kind of classroom to consider. A hospital system, a city, a culture that needed to learn lessons it had been avoiding for far too long. "We're going to make this mean something," she whispered to Lyric, her daughter sleeping peacefully under the glow of warming lights and the steady pulse of medical technology. "What happened to us? It's going to protect other babies, other mothers, other families who deserve better than what we got. That's Mama's promise to you, sweet girl. We're going to make this mean something." Adrian would remember that afternoon in fragments, the way sunlight slanted through the NICU windows at an angle that turned his daughter's incubator into something almost ethereal, the weight of his phone growing heavier in his pocket as it buzzed with calls from city officials and media outlets he couldn't bring himself to answer, the sound of Nia's voice as she sang softly to Lyric, some half-remembered lullaby from her own childhood transformed into a prayer for their daughter's healing. He stood there feeling like a man caught between worlds. The private world where he was simply a terrified father watching his premature daughter fight for every breath, and the public world where he was the mayor of a major city facing a crisis that demanded response and leadership, and decisions that would ripple through thousands of lives. His phone buzzed again. This time he looked at it. Elena Rodriguez, the city attorney. He'd been avoiding her calls for hours, prioritizing his family over his office. But he knew that avoidance had a shelf life. Eventually, he'd have to return to being Mayor Harper instead of just being Adrian, husband and father. Eventually, the personal and political would have to intersect whether he wanted them to or not. He stepped into the hallway, far enough from the NICU that his voice wouldn't disturb the fragile quiet, and returned the call. "Elena," he said, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I'm sorry I haven't been responsive. Things have been—" "I understand," Elena interrupted gently. "And I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important. How's Lyric?" "Stable. Improving. The doctors are optimistic but cautious." He closed his eyes, leaning against the wall, feeling exhaustion creep through his bones like cold water. "She's so small, Elena. So small and so strong at the same time." "She's her parents' daughter," Elena said. "Listen, I hate to do this now, but we need to talk about the investigation. The press has gotten hold of the story. Ramon Vega's video is everywhere. Every major outlet is covering it, and there are protesters gathering outside Metropolitan General demanding accountability. The hospital issued a statement about 2 hours ago acknowledging what happened and committing to reforms, but it's not satisfying anyone. People want to know what the city is doing." Adrian felt something in his chest tighten, the familiar pressure of public responsibility settling onto shoulders that were already carrying too much weight. "What do people want me to say? That I'm investigating the hospital where my wife was assaulted and my daughter was born prematurely? That feels compromised," Elena finished. "I know, which is why I'm handling the direct investigation. But you're still the mayor and people need to hear from you. Not as a victim or a family member, but as the city's chief executive taking responsibility for ensuring this never happens again." "What if I can't be both?" Adrian asked quietly. "What if I can't separate being a father from being a mayor right now? What if standing up there and giving a measured political statement about systemic reform feels like a betrayal of what my wife went through, what my daughter is going through right now?" Elena was silent for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a different quality, less attorney, more friend. "Then you tell the truth. You acknowledge the impossibility of being objective when it's your family. You recuse yourself from the parts where your involvement would compromise justice. But you also use your platform to demand the change that needs to happen, not despite your personal stake, but because of it. Sometimes the most powerful advocacy comes from people who've lived the problem they're trying to solve." Adrian nodded, even though she couldn't see him, processing her words, trying to find the balance between conflicting responsibilities that felt designed to tear him in two directions. Set up a press conference for tomorrow morning, he finally said. 9 a.m. at City Hall. I'll make a statement about the city's response and answer questions. But Elena, I need you to handle everything that involves direct oversight of the hospital. I can't be in the room where decisions are made about liability or settlements or disciplinary actions. I need that separation to be absolute. Already planned for it, Elena assured him. The investigation will be independent, transparent, and conducted by people with no connection to you or your administration. Your role will be limited to high-level policy direction and public accountability. We'll make that clear from the beginning. After the call ended, Adrian stood in the hallway for a long moment, trying to shore up defenses that felt increasingly fragile. Through the window, he could see into the NICU, could see Nia still sitting beside Lyric's incubator, her hand inside the portal, her entire body language speaking of a mother refusing to be separated from her child, even by the necessary boundaries of medical equipment and premature birth. The sight of her, strong and broken and persistent all at once, reminded him why he'd gone into public service in the first place, why he'd believed that institutional power could be wielded for good if the right people were willing to fight for it. He returned to the NICU quietly, settling into a chair beside Nia's wheelchair, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. That was Elena, he said softly. I have to do a press conference tomorrow. The city needs a response, and apparently I'm the one who has to deliver it. Nia looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but fierce. What are you going to say? The truth, I think. That what happened to you happened because systems failed, because warnings were ignored, because people in positions of power chose convenience over accountability. And that those failures cost us 8 weeks with our daughter, cost Lyric the time she needed to develop safely, cost you your dignity and safety when you needed protection most. Don't make it about us, Nia said firmly. Don't make it about the mayor's family getting special attention because of who we are. Make it about every family, every patient, every person who deserves better than what I got. Because the real tragedy isn't that it happened to us. It's that it's been happening to people without our resources and connections for years, and nobody with power cared enough to stop it. Adrian looked at his wife, this woman who'd been assaulted and traumatized and had given birth 2 months early, and who was somehow still thinking about collective justice instead of personal grievance. It was the teacher in her, he thought, that instinct to turn individual experience into broader lessons, to find meaning in suffering by ensuring it led to change that protected others. You're right, he said quietly. You're absolutely right. This isn't about us getting justice. It's about justice becoming available to everyone regardless of who they are or who they know. A soft knock on the NICU room's doorframe interrupted them. Dr. Patel stood there with a tablet in hand and an expression that Adrian had learned to read as cautiously positive. Not quite good news, but not bad news either. I wanted to give you an update on Lyric's progress, she said, stepping inside. We've been monitoring her closely all day and she's exceeding our expectations. Her oxygen saturation has remained stable, her heart rate is consistent, and she's showing good responsiveness to stimulation. We're going to try reducing her ventilator support tonight to see how she manages breathing more independently. Is that safe? Nia asked immediately, maternal protectiveness overriding everything else. If she's not ready, we'll be watching her constantly, Dr. Patel assured her. And if she shows any signs of distress, we'll increase support immediately. But babies born at 32 weeks typically have functional lungs. They just need help initially while they strengthen. Lyric has been breathing over the ventilator, which tells us her lungs are working well. This is a natural progression toward independence. When can I hold her? The question came out almost pleading, Nia's need for physical connection with her daughter overriding any attempt at composure. Dr. Patel's face softened with sympathy. If she continues stable through tonight and tomorrow, we can try kangaroo care tomorrow evening. That's skin-to-skin contact where we place her directly on your chest. It's incredibly beneficial for preemies, helps regulate temperature and heart rate, reduces stress hormones, promotes bonding. Studies show it even improves long-term developmental outcomes. Tomorrow, Nia repeated, like the word was a talisman she could hold on to through the night ahead. 24 more hours, and I can hold my daughter. After Dr. Patel left, Nia continued her vigil beside the incubator while Adrian made the phone calls he could no longer avoid, checking in with his chief of staff about postponing meetings, coordinating with Elena about the press conference, touching base with the city council president to ensure she was briefed before news outlets started calling her for reaction. Each call pulled him further from the NICU and deeper into the political machinery that was already grinding into motion around his family's trauma. By evening, the story had evolved beyond a single viral video into a full-blown national news cycle. Cable networks were running segments analyzing the incident through lenses of healthcare discrimination, maternal mortality disparities, and systemic racism in medical treatment. Social media was exploding with hashtags and personal stories. Thousands of Black women sharing their own experiences of being dismissed, disbelieved, or mistreated by healthcare providers. Medical professionals were weighing in, some defending the difficulty of emergency room triage decisions, others acknowledging that what the video showed was indefensible, regardless of context. And outside Metropolitan General, a protest was growing from a handful of people with handmade signs into something that looked like a movement. Mothers and daughters, healthcare workers in scrubs standing in solidarity with patients, community organizers with megaphones, clergy members leading prayers for Naya and Lyric, and all the other families who'd been failed by systems designed to protect them. Ramon Vega, the janitor who'd recorded the original video, found himself thrust into unwanted spotlight. News crews tracking him down, asking for interviews, treating him like a hero when he insisted he'd simply done what anyone should do when witnessing injustice. He stood at the edge of the protest, looking uncomfortable with the attention but resolute in his message. "I work nights at that hospital," he told a reporter who'd managed to corner him. "I see things. I clean rooms and I listen and I watch how people get treated. And what I saw that night, that wasn't the first time I've seen patients treated badly. But it was the worst. And I thought, somebody needs to see this. Somebody needs to know what happens in that emergency room when nobody important is watching. So I recorded it, I put it online, and now people know. That's all I wanted, for people to know the truth." The reporter pressed him. Did he think he'd be retaliated against? Did he fear losing his job? Would he testify if the case went to trial? Ramon answered each question with simple directness, a man who'd clearly made peace with whatever consequences might follow from doing what he believed was right. "I've been a janitor for 35 years, he said. "I've cleaned offices and hospitals and schools. People don't usually notice me. I'm just the guy who empties the trash and mops the floors. But being invisible means I see things, I hear things. And sometimes being the person nobody pays attention to puts you in position to be the witness everyone needs. So yeah, I'll testify if they need me to. I'll tell the truth. That's not complicated." Inside the hospital, in the administrative wing that had become something like a crisis command center, Dr. Chen and his team were monitoring the protest through windows that overlooked the main entrance. The crowd had grown to several hundred people, their chants audible even through insulated glass. No more silence, no more lies, Black mothers' lives matter, and healthcare is a human right, and justice for Lyric. "We need to address them," Margaret Torres said, watching the growing crowd with an expression that mixed apprehension and something that might have been admiration. "They're not going away, and pretending they don't exist will only make things worse." "And say what?" Dr. Chen asked, sounding exhausted. "We've already issued a statement. We've already committed to reforms. What else can we tell them?" "That we're listening," Margaret said, "that we see them. That we acknowledge the anger and pain and fear they're expressing isn't about one incident, it's about generations of being dismissed and mistreated. That we're not asking them to trust us because we've clearly broken that trust, but that we're committed to earning it back through action instead of just words." Dr. Wellington, who'd been quietly observing the protest, turned from the window. "You should invite them inside. Not to a press conference or formal meeting, but to a community listening session. No speeches from us, no defensive explanations. Just listening. Let people tell their stories about times they or their loved ones were failed by this hospital. Record it, learn from it, use it to inform real change." That's... Dr. Chen hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of opening the hospital to what felt like an angry mob. "That's a significant security risk. And it could expose us to additional liability if people make allegations that..." "If people tell the truth about how they were treated, you mean?" Dr. Wellington interrupted. "The liability already exists. The failures already happened. The question is whether we face them directly or continue hiding behind legal strategy and risk management. I'm voting for facing them." The debate continued, but Margaret had already made her decision. She called security and instructed them to send representatives to the protest organizers with an invitation. The hospital would host a community forum in 3 days, providing space for anyone who wanted to share their experiences with Metropolitan General's care, particularly in the emergency department. No lawyers present, no recording for legal purposes, just hospital leadership listening and committing to let community experience shape institutional reform. The announcement rippled through the protest like an electric current, some people viewing it as genuine engagement, others as empty gesture, most somewhere in between, willing to show up and see if the hospital's actions would match its promises. But the energy shifted slightly, from pure outrage to something more complex, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, this moment was creating opening for the kind of change that usually required decades of advocacy. That evening, as visiting hours in the NICU wound down and nurses began their gentle insistence that parents needed rest, even if babies needed constant monitoring, Nia faced the prospect of being separated from Lyric overnight. The thought of leaving her daughter, still so fragile, still fighting for stability, felt physically impossible, like being asked to amputate part of herself. "I can't leave her," she told Adrian, her voice cracking. "What if something happens? What if she needs me and I'm not here?" "The nurses will call us immediately if anything changes," Adrian said gently, though his own reluctance to leave was written across his face. And Dr. Patel said Lyric needs uninterrupted rest tonight to conserve her energy for the ventilator reduction. She's in the best possible hands. Lorraine, the NICU nurse who'd been so kind earlier, approached with understanding in her eyes. "Mrs. Harper, I know this is impossibly hard, but you just had major surgery this morning. Your body needs rest to heal, and Lyric needs you strong for the weeks ahead. She's going to be in the NICU for at least a month, probably closer to 6 weeks. You can't sustain vigil every night without collapsing. And believe me, we've seen it. Parents who push themselves beyond reasonable limits and end up hospitalized themselves, unable to care for their babies when they're finally ready to go home." "But what if she thinks I abandoned her?" Nia whispered, the question revealing fears that went deeper than logic or medical advice. Lorraine knelt beside the wheelchair, meeting Nia's eyes with the kind of directness that came from years of helping families through impossible situations. "Babies know their mothers, even tiny preemies like Lyric. She felt you through that incubator portal today. She heard your voice. She knows you're here. And when you come back tomorrow morning, she'll know you again. You're not abandoning her. You're taking care of yourself so you can take care of her. That's not selfish. That's necessary." It took another 20 minutes of gentle persuasion before Nia finally agreed to return to her recovery room, but only after spending several minutes talking to Lyric through the incubator, telling her daughter about tomorrow's visit, promising to be back first thing in the morning, singing one more lullaby even though Lyric was asleep and wouldn't consciously hear it. "I love you," Nia whispered, her hand pressed against the plastic barrier that separated them. "More than anything in this world, I love you. Stay strong tonight, baby girl. Fight hard. Mama will be back before you know it." Adrian wheeled her back to the recovery room in silence, both of them processing the strange reality of being parents to a child they couldn't take home, couldn't hold through the night, couldn't protect through proximity and vigilance the way every instinct screamed they should. That night, neither of them slept much. Nia lay in her hospital bed staring at the ceiling, her body aching from surgery, her arms feeling empty, her mind replaying the night before in excruciating detail, every moment she'd stood in that waiting room pleading for help, every dismissive word from Kendra's mouth, every second that had ticked by while her daughter was in distress and no one would listen. The trauma of it was starting to settle into her bones like cold, the delayed emotional reaction finally catching up now that the immediate medical crisis had stabilized into something more like chronic uncertainty. Adrian dozed fitfully in the chair beside her bed, his phone on his chest, set to maximum volume in case the NICU called, his sleep shallow enough that he jerked awake at every footstep in the hallway, every distant sound that might signal emergency. Around 2 a.m., Nia's phone lit up with a text message. She reached for it carefully, mindful of surgical incisions, and saw it was from her principal at Lincoln High School, a woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, who'd been her mentor and advocate for 6 years. "Just saw the news. I'm so sorry this happened to you and your family. Take all the time you need. Your job will be waiting when you're ready. And if there's anything at all, the Lincoln family can do to support you, please let us know. You're in our prayers." The message opened a floodgate. Nia scrolled through her phone and found dozens more, text messages and voicemails from colleagues, former students, parents of kids she'd taught, friends from college, relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, all reaching out with support and outrage and love. Her story had gone beyond viral video into something personal. Thousands of people who knew her or knew of her or simply saw themselves in her experience reaching across digital space to say, "We see you, we believe you, you deserved better." She cried then, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming recognition that she wasn't alone in this, that what had felt like an isolating trauma was actually connecting her to communities of people who'd survived similar violations, who understood the particular pain of being dismissed and diminished by systems that should have protected them. "You okay?" Adrian's voice was rough with interrupted sleep, concern immediately sharpening his awareness. "Yeah," Nia said, wiping her eyes. "Just people are being so kind. I didn't expect this much support." Adrian reached for her hand in the darkness. "That's because what happened to you matters. Because your story is giving voice to thousands of other stories that never got told. You didn't ask for this platform, but you have it now. And how you choose to use it, that's going to matter too." Nia thought about that through the remaining hours of darkness, about the difference between being a victim and being an advocate, about whether she had the strength to transform personal trauma into public testimony that might protect others. By the time dawn began to lighten the windows, she'd made a decision. "I want to speak at that community forum," she told Adrian as he stirred awake to early morning light. "The one the hospital is hosting. I want to tell my story directly, not filtered through news reports or social media. I want people to hear what it felt like to stand in that waiting room bleeding and begging and being treated like I was worthless." "Are you sure?" Adrian asked carefully. "You don't owe anyone your story. You don't have to relive that trauma publicly if it's too painful." "It's already public," Nia pointed out. "The video is everywhere. People have seen what happened to me, but they haven't heard it from me. My voice, my words, my perspective on what it felt like from inside that experience. And I think—" She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I think there's power in refusing to be silenced, in standing up and saying, 'This is what you did to me, this is how it felt, and this is what needs to change.' Not for revenge, but for prevention." Adrian studied his wife's face, seeing the determination there, the teacher preparing to deliver the most important lesson of her career. "Then I'll be right there beside you," he promised. "Whatever you need to say, however you need to say it, I've got your back." 2 hours later, after Nia had been cleared by her surgical team and they'd both returned to the NICU for morning rounds, Dr. Patel delivered news that shifted everything from endurance to hope. "Lyric did beautifully overnight," she announced, unable to hide her smile. "We reduced her ventilator support around midnight, and she maintained perfect oxygen saturation on her own. Her breathing rate is strong and consistent, her heart rate is stable, and she's been awake and alert this morning, responding to voices and touch. She's a fighter, this one." "Does that mean—" Nia couldn't finish the question, afraid to hope too much. "It means if she continues like this through the day, we can try kangaroo care this evening, like we discussed. Skin-to-skin contact, you holding your daughter for the first time." Nia dissolved into tears, relief and joy and anticipation all crashing together. Adrian wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of her surgical recovery, his own eyes wet with emotion he'd been holding back for 36 hours. "You hear that, Lyric?" he said, his voice thick as he addressed their daughter through the incubator. "Your mama's going to hold you tonight. You've been fighting so hard to get strong enough, and it's working. You're doing it, baby girl." The rest of that day passed in a strange suspension between past trauma and emerging hope, between the press conference Adrian had to give at City Hall and the moment when Nia might finally hold her daughter, between accountability for what had been broken and possibility for what might be healed. Time moved in fits and starts, stretching and compressing unpredictably, as if the universe itself couldn't decide whether to rush toward resolution or linger in the terrible beauty of survival against odds. At 9 a.m., Adrian stood at a podium in City Hall's main press room, cameras pointed at him like weapons, reporters crowded shoulder to shoulder, the weight of public expectation settling onto him like gravity. Adrian gripped the edges of the podium, feeling the smooth wood beneath his palms, grounding himself in that physical sensation before looking up at the sea of faces and cameras. He'd given hundreds of press conferences over his years in public service, had learned to project confidence and authority even when uncertainty gnawed at him from inside. But this moment felt different. This wasn't political theater or policy announcement. This was personal testimony disguised as official statement, and every person in that room knew it. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotion underneath. "I'm here today to address the incident that occurred at Metropolitan General Hospital 2 nights ago involving my wife, Nia Harper, and to outline the city's response. But before I do that, I need to acknowledge something. I'm standing here as your mayor, but I'm also standing here as a husband whose wife was assaulted while seeking medical care, and as a father whose daughter was born 2 months premature as a direct result of that assault and the denial of timely treatment. Those 2 roles, public official and private citizen, are impossible to fully separate in this moment. So I'm not going to pretend they can be." He paused, letting that honesty settle over the room, seeing reporters lean forward slightly, sensing something different than the usual carefully managed political response. "What happened to my wife should never happen to anyone. She arrived at a hospital emergency room at 3 a.m., 32 weeks pregnant, experiencing cramping and bleeding. She asked for help. She did everything right. She was polite, she was patient, she explained her symptoms clearly, and she was systematically dismissed, verbally abused, and ultimately physically assaulted by a nurse whose job was to provide care. That assault was witnessed by multiple people, recorded on multiple devices, and the evidence is unambiguous. Nurse Kendra Barlow struck my wife in the face while Nia was in medical distress. There is no justification for that. None." A reporter called out a question, but Adrian raised his hand, not ready to cede control of the narrative yet. "Here's what I need everyone to understand. This isn't just about one nurse having a bad night. The investigation that City Attorney Elena Rodriguez is conducting has already uncovered a pattern of complaints against Nurse Barlow spanning 9 years. Complaints that were filed and then dismissed as personality conflicts or communication issues. Complaints from patients who reported feeling dismissed, disrespected, or discriminated against. And those complaints were never properly investigated or acted upon. That represents a systemic failure of oversight, accountability, and patient protection." He could see Dr. Chen in the back of the room, his face pale, flanked by Patricia Vance and other hospital administrators who'd been required to attend. They looked like people watching their institution's reputation crumble in real time, and part of Adrian felt satisfaction at their discomfort, even as he recognized that satisfaction itself is a kind of poison, wanting vengeance instead of justice, wanting punishment instead of prevention. The city is conducting a comprehensive investigation of Metropolitan General's emergency department, with particular focus on triage protocols, complaint handling procedures, and patterns of disparate treatment. That investigation will be led by City Attorney Rodriguez and conducted independently of my office to avoid any conflict of interest. The findings will be made public, and recommendations for reform will be binding and enforced through the city's regulatory authority over healthcare facilities. A Black woman reporter in the front row, someone Adrian recognized from the local NBC affiliate, raised her hand. He nodded to her. "Mayor Harper, your wife's experience has resonated particularly strongly with Black women who've shared their own stories of being dismissed or mistreated in healthcare settings. Do you see what happened as an isolated incident or as part of broader patterns of racial discrimination in medical care?" Adrian took a breath, knowing this question would come, knowing his answer would be scrutinized and quoted and used either to support or undermine whatever came next. "I think refusing to see the racial dimension of what happened would be willfully blind," he said carefully. "My wife is a Black woman. The nurse who assaulted her made assumptions about Nia's intelligence, her income, her worthiness of care, assumptions that were audible in the video and testified to by witnesses. Whether those assumptions were consciously racial or simply reflected unconscious bias, the effect was the same. My wife was treated as less deserving of care, less credible in reporting her symptoms, less worthy of dignity and respect. And that treatment fits into documented patterns of Black maternal mortality and morbidity, patterns where Black women are significantly more likely to have their pain dismissed, their symptoms minimized, and their advocacy for themselves met with hostility instead of help. He saw several reporters nodding, saw others taking notes frantically, saw the hospital administrators looking even more uncomfortable as the racial dimension was named explicitly rather than euphemistically referenced as disparate treatment or communication challenges. But I also want to be clear, Adrian continued, that acknowledging racism doesn't mean every bad interaction is purely about race. What happened to my wife was about power, a person in authority who felt entitled to dismiss and demean a vulnerable patient. The racial dimension made that power imbalance worse, made it easier for the nurse to see my wife as less than fully human, less deserving of care. But the underlying problem is about how we train healthcare workers, how we handle complaints, how we build cultures that either protect patients or protect staff at patients' expense. We need to address both the specific racism and the broader systems that enable abuse. Another reporter jumped in. What about criminal charges? Is Nurse Barlow being prosecuted? That's a decision for the district attorney's office, not for me, Adrian said. But Detective Sarah Chen has recommended assault charges based on clear video evidence. I expect the DA will review that recommendation and make a charging decision based on the merits. What I can tell you is that Nurse Barlow has been suspended without pay by Metropolitan General pending the outcome of criminal and administrative investigations, and her nursing license is under review by the state board. And what about your daughter? This from a sympathetic-looking older woman from one of the local papers. How is she doing? Adrian's expression softened, the mayor receding slightly as the father emerged. Lyric is stable and exceeding expectations for a baby born at 32 weeks. She's in the NICU at Metropolitan General, being cared for by an incredible team of doctors and nurses who are everything healthcare workers should be, skilled, compassionate, devoted to their patients' well-being. She's strong, she's fighting, and if things continue as they have been, my wife will be able to hold her for the first time tonight. The emotion in his voice was genuine and unfiltered, and he saw several reporters react to it, some with visible sympathy, others with the slightly predatory alertness of people recognizing a compelling human interest angle for their stories. I want to say something else, Adrian added, his voice strengthening again. To all the people who've shared their own stories over the past 2 days, who've talked about times they or their loved ones were dismissed or mistreated in healthcare settings. I hear you. This city hears you. And we're committed to using this moment not just to address what happened to my family, but to create change that protects everyone. Because the tragedy isn't just that this happened to the mayor's wife. The tragedy is that it's been happening to people without resources or connections or platforms for years, and nobody with power cared enough to force accountability. That ends now. He took questions for another 20 minutes, deflecting some that were too personal, answering others with the careful precision of someone who knew every word would be analyzed, maintaining the balance between grieving father and responsible executive. When he finally stepped away from the podium, he felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the cost of performing composure when everything inside wanted to either rage or weep. Elena caught up with him in the hallway outside the press room, her heels clicking on marble floors as she matched his stride. That was good, she said quietly. Honest but measured. Personal but not exploitative. You threaded a difficult needle. Doesn't feel good, Adrian admitted. Feels like I'm using my daughter's suffering for political capital. You're using your platform to demand change that will protect other people's daughters, Elena corrected. There's a difference. And I think people heard that difference. She handed him a folder thick with preliminary findings. This is what we've uncovered so far from the hospital records. 15 documented complaints against Kendra Barlow over 9 years. Multiple involving allegations of racial bias, dismissive treatment, and hostility toward patients advocating for themselves. And here's the part that's going to make you angry. 8 of those complaints came from Black patients, or patients of color. The pattern was visible if anyone had bothered to look. Adrian flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening as he read summaries of incidents that echoed Nia's experience. Patients made to wait unreasonably long, symptoms dismissed as exaggeration, families treated with contempt when they questioned care decisions. Each complaint had been investigated minimally and resolved with outcomes like counseling provided or no policy violation found or Personality conflict documented. This is negligence, he said flatly. This is Metropolitan General prioritizing staff retention over patient safety and hoping nobody with enough power would notice the pattern. Agreed, Elena said, which is why the city's investigation is going to go beyond just Barlow. We're looking at who reviewed these complaints, who decided they didn't warrant serious action, who created a culture where this behavior was tolerated. Margaret Torres, the chief nursing officer, has already indicated she's accepting responsibility for oversight failures. We'll see if that extends to resignation. And the community forum? Adrian asked, remembering what he'd heard about the hospital's plan. Happening tomorrow night, 7 p.m. in the hospital's main auditorium. They're expecting several hundred people, and Nia told me this morning she wants to speak. Adrian stopped walking, turning to face Elena with surprise evident on his face. She told you that? When? About an hour ago. She called me directly, said she wanted to make sure she'd be on the agenda, said she had things she needed to say that couldn't wait for depositions or court testimony. Elena's expression was admiring. Your wife is remarkable. She's been through hell, and she's choosing to walk back into the fire to make sure it leads somewhere meaningful. That's Nia, Adrian said, pride and worry mixing in his chest. She's always been the bravest person I know. I hope she's not pushing herself too hard too fast. She seemed very clear about what she wanted, Elena assured him. But you should talk to her. Make sure she's really ready for what public testimony means. By the time Adrian returned to the hospital, it was early afternoon and Nia was back in the NICU, sitting in her now familiar position beside Lyric's incubator, her hand inside the portal, her voice soft as she talked to their daughter about everything and nothing. What the nurses had said during rounds, what she planned to wear when she held Lyric later, memories from her own childhood she wanted to pass on. Hey, Adrian said softly, not wanting to interrupt, but needing to see her, needing to be close to both his wife and daughter after the performance of the press conference. Nia looked up, her face brightening. How'd it go? As well as could be expected. I told the truth mostly. Tried to balance being your husband with being the mayor. Elena said you called her about speaking at the forum tomorrow. Nia's expression shifted, determination settling over the grief that had been her baseline for 2 days. I need to do it, Adrian. I need people to hear my voice, not just see the video. I need to stand up there and say, this is what happened to me. This is how it felt. And this is why it can never happen to anyone else. I know, Adrian said, settling into the chair beside her. I just want to make sure you're ready. Public testimony is brutal. People will question you, challenge you, maybe even attack you. Defense attorneys will use your words to try to minimize what happened or suggest you're exaggerating. It's going to be hard. Harder than standing in that waiting room bleeding while a nurse laughed at me? Nia asked, her voice sharp. Harder than being slapped in the face while begging for help for my baby? Harder than giving birth 2 months early because nobody would listen? I've already lived through the hardest part. Talking about it publicly is just truth-telling. And I'm a teacher. I know how to tell difficult truths in ways that land. Adrian took her free hand, the one that wasn't touching Lyric, and held it carefully. Then I'll be right there with you. Whatever you need to say, however you need to say it, I'm with you. They sat together in the NICU's artificial quiet, the three of them connected across plastic barriers and institutional rules and the strange circumstances that had made them a family under duress. Around them, other families kept their own vigils, parents of other premature babies, other stories of crisis and hope, and the long, uncertain road between birth and bringing babies home. At 7 p.m., after Dr. Patel had made her final assessment and declared Lyric stable enough for the attempt, the preparations for kangaroo care began. Nia was moved to a comfortable chair, more like a recliner, and positioned at an angle that would support her post-surgical body while allowing Lyric to rest on her chest. A privacy screen was set up around them. Lorraine, the NICU nurse, carefully explained the process. We're going to take Lyric out of the incubator and place her directly on your chest, skin to skin. She'll still have her monitors attached so we can watch her vitals, but otherwise it will just be you and your daughter, no barriers. She'll hear your heartbeat, feel your warmth, smell your scent. For premature babies, this kind of contact is medicine. It literally helps regulate their systems and promote development. Nia nodded, not trusting herself to speak, her hands already moving to unbutton her hospital gown in preparation. Adrian stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, both of them watching as Lorraine opened the incubator and carefully lifted Lyric out of her plastic nest. The baby looked impossibly small in the nurse's competent hands, 4 pounds and 3 ounces of fragile human life, wires and monitors trailing from her tiny body, a knitted cap on her head, and a diaper that looked like it was made for dolls. Her eyes were closed, her face scrunched in the particular way of newborns who weren't quite sure what to make of this strange new world they'd been thrust into. "Here we go," Lorraine said softly, lowering Lyric onto Nia's bare chest, positioning her so the baby's ear was over her mother's heart, adjusting wires and monitors, making sure everything was secure and safe. The moment Lyric's skin touched Nia's, something shifted in both of them. Nia's face transformed, all the pain and fear and grief of the past 2 days melting into something closer to transcendence. Her arms came up instinctively to cradle her daughter, to hold and protect and connect with this tiny person who'd been inside her body and was now, finally, in her arms. "Oh," Nia breathed, the sound somewhere between sob and prayer. "Oh, baby girl. Oh, Lyric. I've got you. Mama's got you." Lyric stirred slightly against her mother's chest, making small movements, her miniature hands curling and uncurling, her breathing synchronized to Nia's heartbeat. The monitors showed her vitals stabilizing even further, heart rate dropping to a calm, steady rhythm, oxygen saturation holding perfect, all the numbers that represented life itself settling into patterns that spoke of a baby feeling safe and held. Adrian knelt beside the chair, one hand on Nia's shoulder, the other gently touching Lyric's back, his face wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. This was the moment that should have happened in a delivery room 2 months from now, the golden hour of bonding that trauma had stolen and persistence had finally recovered. It wasn't what they'd planned, wasn't how they'd imagined becoming parents, but it was theirs, hard-won and precious, and proof that survival could transform into something approaching joy. "She's perfect," Adrian whispered. "Look at her. She's absolutely perfect." "She's a fighter," Nia said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just like we knew she would be. Getting strong so she can come home with us, so she can have the life she deserves." They stayed like that for an hour, the world narrowing to just the 3 of them. Lorraine checking monitors periodically, but otherwise giving them privacy to be a family without observation or intervention. Nia talked to Lyric the entire time, telling her daughter about the home waiting for her, the nursery Adrian had painted yellow because they'd wanted to be surprised about gender, the books she'd already bought for bedtime stories, the grandmother in Atlanta who was flying in tomorrow to meet her newest granddaughter. When the hour ended and Lyric had to go back into the incubator to maintain her temperature and continue her monitored rest, Nia handed her daughter to Lorraine with visible reluctance, her arms feeling empty again, her chest cold where warmth had been. "You'll do this again tomorrow," Lorraine promised, "and the next day. As much as Lyric can tolerate, we'll keep giving you this time together. Before you know it, she'll be strong enough to room in with you and then to go home." That night, Nia slept better than she had since the assault, her body finally convinced that her daughter was real and alive and fighting, her mind finally able to rest from the exhausting work of catastrophic fear. Adrian stayed beside her, his own sleep deeper and less haunted, both of them beginning the long process of healing from trauma, even as they understood that healing was neither linear nor complete. The next evening, Metropolitan General's main auditorium was packed beyond its official capacity, people standing along the walls and sitting in aisles, the air thick with anticipation and anger and hope all mixed together. The hospital had set up a simple stage with a podium and microphone. No fancy presentations or defensive PowerPoints, just space for voices to be heard. Dr. Chen opened the forum with a brief statement acknowledging failure and committing to listen, then stepped aside and let the community speak. For 3 hours, people told stories, some about Kendra Barlow specifically, others about different staff members or different incidents, all of them sharing the common thread of feeling dismissed, disrespected, or denied appropriate care. Elderly patients talked about being treated like burdens. Parents described watching their children's pain be minimized. Multiple Black women shared experiences eerily similar to Nia's. Being made to wait while white patients were seen first, having their symptoms questioned, being treated with hostility when they advocated for themselves. Each testimony landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, building into a collective indictment of systems that had failed repeatedly and predictably, that had protected institutional reputation over individual dignity, that had chosen convenient silence over uncomfortable accountability. When Nia's turn came, she walked to the podium carefully, still healing from surgery, Adrian beside her but slightly behind, letting her own the space and the moment. The room fell completely silent, everyone understanding they were about to hear from the woman whose suffering had catalyzed this reckoning. "My name is Nia Harper," she began, her teacher voice carrying clearly through the auditorium without needing amplification. "2 nights ago, I walked into Metropolitan General's emergency room pregnant and scared, asking for help. What happened next has been captured on video that millions of people have seen. But what the video can't show is what it felt like from inside that experience. The particular kind of helplessness that comes from being in pain and being dismissed. The humiliation of having to beg for basic care. The terror of knowing something's wrong with your baby and being told you're overreacting." She paused, gathering herself, her hands gripping the podium edge the way Adrian had gripped it at his press conference, needing something solid to anchor against emotion that threatened to overwhelm. "I teach high school English. I spend my days with teenagers, helping them find their voices, teaching them to advocate for themselves, showing them that their experiences and perspectives matter. And I'm good at it. I know how to communicate clearly, how to navigate difficult conversations, how to assert my needs while respecting others. I did everything right that night. I was polite. I was patient. I explained my symptoms clearly. And none of it mattered, because the person whose job was to help me had decided, based on what I looked like, how I spoke, assumptions about who I was, that I wasn't worth her time or compassion." Nia's voice strengthened, finding its teaching rhythm, that particular cadence that made complicated truths accessible and undeniable. "Nurse Barlow slapped me. That's what everyone focuses on because it was captured on camera, because it was so egregious that even people predisposed to defend healthcare workers couldn't find justification. But the violence started before that slap. It started when she looked at me and saw not a patient needing care, but a problem to be managed. It started when she made assumptions about my income, my insurance, my worthiness of her attention. It continued every time she dismissed my concerns, every time she kept me waiting while seeing other patients, every time she responded to my increasing desperation with hostility instead of help. The slap was just the moment when that ongoing violence became undeniable. She could see people in the audience nodding, see other black women crying, see recognition spreading through the room as her words gave language to experiences many had lived but struggled to articulate. My daughter Lyric was born at 32 weeks, 2 months premature, because I was denied timely care. She weighed 4 pounds and 3 ounces. She needed a ventilator to breathe. She's in the NICU right now, fighting to get strong enough to come home. That's what that violence cost, not just my dignity or my sense of safety, but my daughter's health. 8 weeks of development she needed and didn't get. Separation during the time when we should have been bonding. Those costs are real and permanent, and no punishment Nurse Barlow faces will undo them." Nia's voice softened, shifting from testimony to teaching, from personal grievance to collective call to action. "But here's what I want everyone in this room to understand. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about destroying one person's career or bankrupting one hospital. This is about recognizing that my story isn't unique, it's representative. It's about acknowledging that black maternal mortality rates are 3 to 4 times higher than white maternal mortality rates. Not because black women's bodies are inferior, but because black women's pain is systematically dismissed. Our advocacy for ourselves is met with hostility. Our humanity is treated as negotiable. It's about understanding that implicit bias training and diversity statements mean nothing if complaints are filed and ignored, if patterns are visible and nobody with power looks." She turned slightly, addressing the hospital administrators sitting in the front row, making them meet her eyes. "You knew. Maybe not about that specific night, but you knew there were problems. You knew Kendra Barlow had complaints filed against her. You knew patients were reporting feeling dismissed and discriminated against. And you chose to minimize those complaints, to protect your staff member over protecting vulnerable patients, to avoid difficult conversations about racism and power abuse. That choice has consequences. Those consequences are in your NICU right now, a 2-month premature baby fighting to breathe. But they're also in the experiences of every person who testified tonight, every family that avoided your hospital because they'd heard it wasn't safe for people who looked like them, every patient who suffered in silence because they knew complaining wouldn't help. The room was completely silent now, people barely breathing, everyone understanding they were witnessing something rare. Not a victim asking for sympathy, but a teacher delivering a lesson that cut through defensiveness to expose uncomfortable truths. So here's what I need from you, Nia continued, her voice firm with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to make demands. I need transparency about what went wrong, not just with my case, but systemically. I need concrete reforms with measurable outcomes and independent oversight. I need training that goes beyond checking boxes to actually changing culture. I need hiring and promotion practices that value cultural competence and patient advocacy, not just technical skill and seniority. I need complaint processes that protect whistleblowers and take patient reports seriously from the first incident, not the 15th. And I need all of this to happen not because I'm the mayor's wife, not because my story went viral, but because it's right. Because the next woman who walks into your emergency room deserves better than what I got, regardless of who she is or who she knows. She stepped back from the podium, done speaking, having said what she came to say without apology or equivocation. The silence held for another heartbeat. Then the auditorium erupted into applause. Not polite appreciation, but something raw and more cathartic. Recognition and validation and determination all rolled into ovation that lasted several minutes. Adrian met her as she stepped down from the stage, wrapping his arms around her carefully, his face showing nothing but pride and love and awe at her courage. That was perfect, he whispered against her hair. You were perfect. Everything you said, it was exactly what needed to be said. Over the following weeks, Metropolitan General underwent transformation that would have seemed impossible before that night in the emergency room. Kendra Barlow was charged with assault and reckless endangerment. Her nursing license formally revoked. Her career in healthcare ended permanently. The hospital settled with the Harper family for an undisclosed amount that sources suggested was substantial, with conditions requiring the money be partially directed toward maternal health initiatives and implicit bias training programs. Margaret Torres resigned from her position as chief nursing officer, acknowledging her failures of oversight in a letter that was notable for its lack of defensiveness or excuse-making. Dr. Chen announced he would not seek renewal of his contract when it expired, effectively ending his tenure as hospital administrator. The emergency department underwent complete restructuring, new leadership, new protocols for triage and complaint handling, new training requirements for all staff, and establishment of a patient advocacy office with direct authority to investigate concerns independent of department hierarchy. The city's investigation, led by Elena Rodriguez, produced a comprehensive report that documented not just the Harper case, but patterns of inequitable care spanning years. The report's recommendations became binding requirements, backed by the city's regulatory authority and monitored by a community oversight board that included healthcare professionals, civil rights advocates, and people who'd experienced discrimination in medical settings. For Naya and Adrian, the weeks passed in a rhythm defined by NICU visits and slow healing, both physical and emotional. Lyric grew stronger day by day, graduating from ventilator to oxygen support to breathing completely independently. She gained weight, hitting 4 pounds and 8 ounces, then 5 pounds, then 5.5. Her eyes opened and focused, tracking her parents' faces as they talked to her and held her during increasingly long periods of kangaroo care. 6 weeks after her premature birth, on what would have been her original due date if trauma hadn't intervened, Lyric Harper was finally released from the NICU to go home. She weighed 6 pounds and 1 ounce, all her systems stable, her development progressing normally, her future stretching out before her with the promise that comes from surviving what should have been unsurvivable. Nia carried her daughter out of Metropolitan General in her arms, no longer separated by incubator plastic or medical necessity, just a mother and baby connected the way they were meant to be. Adrian walked beside them, carrying the discharge paperwork and car seat and bags full of hospital supplies, his face showing exhaustion and relief and joy all mixed together. "Ready to take her home?" he asked as they paused at the hospital entrance, the same automatic doors Nia had walked through 2 months earlier in pain and fear, now exiting with triumph and cautious hope. More than ready, Naya said, looking down at Lyric's face. Those eyes that were developing color somewhere between brown and hazel, that determined chin she'd inherited from Adrian, that little nose that was all Nia. It's time for her to see the world that's been waiting for her. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm and bright, transforming the hospital parking lot into something almost beautiful. Ramon Vega was there, having arranged his schedule to be present for this moment, along with Dr. Elise Park, who'd tried to help that first terrible night, and Lorraine from the NICU, who'd become something like family over weeks of shared vigil. They'd all come to witness this ending that was also a beginning, this moment when survival transformed into thriving, when trauma's grip finally loosened enough to let hope breathe. "Thank you," Nia said to each of them, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you for seeing me when it mattered, for standing up when it was hard, for taking care of my daughter when I couldn't. We won't forget that, ever." "You take care of that beautiful girl," Ramon said, his weathered face creased with genuine affection. "And you keep fighting for the changes you started. The world needs more teachers willing to turn their pain into lessons that protect other people." They drove home carefully, Adrian treating every traffic light and turn like the precious cargo in the back seat required ceremonial caution. Lyric slept through most of the drive, secured in her car seat, her tiny chest rising and falling with the easy rhythm of healthy breathing, unaware of the drama and trauma and transformation that had surrounded her entry into the world. The nursery was exactly as they'd left it 2 months earlier. Yellow walls and carefully assembled crib, books on shelves and stuffed animals arranged with love, everything waiting for the baby who'd been promised and then nearly lost. Nia stood in the doorway holding Lyric, taking in the space that had been theoretical and was now reality, feeling the weight of her daughter in her arms as proof that, despite everything, despite cruelty and negligence and all the ways systems had failed them, they'd survived. They'd more than survived. They'd fought back. They'd demanded change. They'd transformed their trauma into testimony that was already protecting others. "Welcome home, Lyric Harper," Nia whispered, carrying her daughter to the crib she'd been dreaming of using for months. "This is where you were always meant to be, safe and loved and surrounded by people who fought for you before you could fight for yourself." She laid Lyric down carefully, watching as her daughter's eyes blinked open briefly, that unfocused newborn gaze that seemed to see everything and nothing all at once, before closing again into the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that spoke of a baby who felt secure in the world she'd been born into. Adrian wrapped his arms around Nia from behind, both of them looking down at their daughter, both understanding that this moment, quiet and domestic and utterly ordinary, was the miracle they'd been fighting for. Not viral videos or policy reforms or criminal prosecutions, though all of those mattered. But this, a family intact, a daughter breathing, a future reclaimed from the jaws of preventable tragedy. "We did it," Adrian said softly. "We got her home." "We did," Naya agreed. "And now we make sure every other family gets the same chance. Every other mother who walks into an emergency room asking for help gets heard instead of dismissed. Every other baby gets born when they're supposed to, with support instead of obstacles. That's the real work ahead." "I know," Adrian said, "and we'll do it together, the three of us. Our family's story is going to mean something beyond what happened to us. It already does." In the months and years that followed, the Harper family's testimony and advocacy did exactly that. The reforms at Metropolitan General became models for other hospitals across the state and eventually the nation. Maternal health disparities began to narrow, not because of any single intervention, but because of accumulating attention and accountability, because of people like Nia who turned personal trauma into public testimony, because of witnesses like Ramon who refused to look away when power abused the powerless. Kendra Barlow served 8 months in county jail and 2 years of supervised probation, required to complete extensive counseling in community service and environments where she could learn about the impact of her actions. She never worked in healthcare again, her license permanently revoked, her career ended by the convergence of her own cruelty and the witnesses who refused to let that cruelty hide in darkness. But the real legacy of that night wasn't about punishment, it was about prevention. about systems slowly, imperfectly bending toward justice because people demanded it and wouldn't accept excuses, about incremental progress that accumulated into measurable change, reducing the likelihood that another Nia Harper would stand in another waiting room, bleeding and begging and being treated like her suffering didn't matter. Lyric grew into a bright, determined child who loved books and questions, and pushing boundaries in that way children do when they're secure enough to test the world without fearing it will break them. She knew her story, not the trauma of it, which her parents protected her from understanding too young, but the essential truth that she'd been born early, that she'd spent her first weeks in the hospital, that her entrance into the world had been harder than it should have been, but she'd fought through it with strength inherited from parents who'd fought for her. On her 5th birthday, Nia took Lyric back to Metropolitan General for the first time since they'd brought her home as an infant. Not to the emergency room, but to the NICU, where they'd been invited to a celebration honoring families whose stories had transformed hospital culture. Lorraine was retiring after 35 years in neonatal nursing, and she'd specifically asked for the Harpers to attend, wanting them to see what their advocacy had helped create. The NICU looked different now, still filled with tiny babies and worried parents, and the electronic symphony of monitoring equipment, but also filled with new protocols and training programs and a culture that elevated patient dignity alongside technical care. The walls held photos of graduates, babies who'd survived against odds, families who'd endured the particular terror of premature birth and come through to the other side. Lyric's picture was there, a tiny infant in an incubator transformed through time into the bright-eyed kindergartner holding Nia's hand, looking around with curiosity at this place that had been her first home. "This is where you got strong," Nia told her daughter, kneeling to Lyric's height, pointing to the photo. "This is where doctors and nurses took care of you until you were ready to come home with Mama and Daddy." "Was I really that small?" Lyric asked, studying the photo with the fascination of a child trying to reconcile her current self with an infant who seemed impossibly tiny. "You were," Nia confirmed, "but you were strong even then, fighting hard, getting bigger every day, teaching everyone around you about courage and resilience." Lorraine appeared, her face lighting up when she saw them. "Look at you," she exclaimed to Lyric. "Last time I saw you, you fit in 2 of my hands. Now you're this big, beautiful girl." "I was in your hospital," Lyric said solemnly, with that childhood gravity that made simple statements sound profound. "Mama said you helped take care of me." "I did," Lorraine confirmed. "And it was an honor. You and your mama taught everyone here some important lessons about listening to patients, about treating people with dignity, about what happens when we forget that healthcare is about caring, not just treating." She turned to Nia, her eyes bright with emotion. "I wanted you here today because I'm retiring, and I wanted my last official act to be thanking you. What you did, standing up and speaking out even when it was hard, it changed this place, changed how we train staff, how we handle complaints, how we think about equity and justice in healthcare. You made us better." Nia felt tears prick her eyes, the validation landing somewhere deep and healing. "Thank you for taking care of my daughter, for being everything a nurse should be when my family needed it most." They stood together in the NICU where trauma and healing had intersected, where a premature baby had fought for life while her parents fought for justice, where individual suffering had catalyzed institutional change that would protect thousands of other families from experiencing the same preventable harm. That evening, back in the home they'd brought Lyric to 5 years earlier, the Harper family gathered around the dinner table, Nia, Adrian, and their daughter, who'd survived against odds and thrived beyond expectation. They held hands, and Nia offered the blessings she'd developed over years of turning trauma into gratitude without forgetting the cost. "We're thankful for this family, for Lyric's health and strength, for everyone who stood beside us when things were hardest. We're thankful for the changes that came from our suffering, for the families being protected by reforms we helped create. And we remember those who aren't as fortunate, who still fight battles against systems that should support them, but don't. May we always use our voice and our platform to demand justice, not just for ourselves, but for everyone." "Amen," Adrian said softly. "Amen," Lyric repeated, not fully understanding but recognizing the ritual of acknowledgement and hope. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, hospitals treating patients, families navigating crisis, systems operating with all their imperfect mechanisms of help and harm. But somewhere in that vast machinery, changes had taken root. Protocols that centered patient dignity, training that addressed implicit bias, oversight that took complaints seriously from the first report rather than the 15th, culture that elevated compassion alongside competence. None of it was perfect. None of it would prevent every tragedy or correct every injustice. But all of it mattered. All of it represented the painstaking work of turning trauma into testimony, testimony into accountability, accountability into change that accumulated across time into something approaching justice. And in a home filled with books and laughter and the ordinary miracle of a family intact, Nia Harper held her daughter close and knew that their story, painful as it had been to live, difficult as it remained to remember, had meant something beyond their own survival. They'd lit a fire that refused to be extinguished, demanding that the system see them not as problems to be managed, but as human beings deserving of dignity, care, and the simple promise that asking for help wouldn't be met with cruelty. That night, as Nia tucked Lyric into bed, her daughter asked the question she asked most evenings, a ritual born from curiosity about her own origins. "Tell me my story, Mama. Tell me about when I was born." And Nia did, in language calibrated for a 5-year-old's understanding, a story about a baby who came early, who was small but strong, who had people who loved her and fought for her and made sure she could grow up safe. She left out the cruelty and the slap and the bleeding in a waiting room. Those details would come later when Lyric was old enough to understand them, old enough to carry the weight of knowing her birth had been both trauma and catalyst. For now, Nia gave her daughter the story she needed, a story about love and survival, about fighting for what matters, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. A story that was fundamentally true even in its simplification, even in what it left unsaid. "And now you're here," Nia finished, kissing Lyric's forehead, "strong and healthy and exactly where you're supposed to be." "I love you, Mama," Lyric murmured, already drifting toward sleep. "I love you too, baby girl," Nia whispered. "More than you'll ever know." She turned off the light and stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter sleep in the nursery that had waited 2 months to be occupied, in the home that had held its breath until its newest member arrived safely. The journey from that terrible night in the emergency room to this peaceful evening had been long and painful and transformative, marked by small victories and hard-won changes, by testimony that refused to be silenced and advocacy that demanded accountability. It wasn't the story Nia would have chosen, but it was the story they'd lived, and in living it with courage and refusing to let suffering be meaningless, they'd written something more powerful than any narrative she'd taught in her English classroom, a real-world lesson about justice, resilience, and the revolutionary act of demanding that systems designed to help actually deliver on that promise for everyone, not just the privileged and powerful. That was Lyric's inheritance, not the trauma, but the transformation, not the violence, but the voice that rose in response to violence and said never again, not to anyone, not on our watch. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough to turn tragedy into triumph, survival into thriving, and a premature baby fighting for breath into a 5-year-old girl sleeping peacefully, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, protected, and part of a story that mattered far beyond her family's walls. The night they couldn't silence her had ended, but the change she'd catalyzed was just beginning, rippling outward in ways that would protect mothers and babies for generations to come, proving that even in our darkest moments, even when systems fail and cruelty prevails, the human capacity for resilience and justice can transform suffering into something redemptive. Not erasing what was broken, but building something better from the fragments that remain.